Hello, this is Thomas Brady, the director of The Heart of the Seas, and this will be the audio commentary for the film. Now, the last time I did something like this was with Legend, and there wasn't a whole lot to talk about on that one. But this time around, there is a whole lot I want to talk about. I have 22 pages of notes here, so hopefully this will be a lot less awkward than the Legend commentary was. So, yeah, let's just jump right into it. Before we get into the actual logistics of filming itself, I should probably mention the history with Cade Davis. You'll see him listed in the opening credits here as the creator of the characters, which is more or less true. This all pretty much started with him. Him and I have been friends for a very long time. I think we first met during elementary school or something around there. The origins of this project can be traced all the way back to him. There was a trip my family and I took to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, I want to say 2014-ish, and we invited Cade along since he was a good friend of mine. We spent a lot of time at the hotel water park, and we talked a great deal about how cool it would be to make a comic series. At that time, we were both really into Pirates of the Caribbean, but we were also really big Lord of the Rings fans, and so we combined the two. Now, as stupid as this is all going to sound, we had both just turned 13 at that time, so cut us a bit of slack, okay? We got to work right away on a comic series in our hotel room, and it looked, pretty weird. It was just ridiculous. It was supposed to take place, like, 500 years or so after the events of Lord of the Rings, and, there were pirate ships, and apparently the British Empire existed in Middle-earth for some reason, which means they discovered firearms. Yeah, it was really weird. Now, as terrible as that all sounds, the idea of a unlikely pirate crew banding together to stop an evil bad guy trying to resurrect an ancient power was actually from those original comics, which technically were the idea of Cade, so the characters were based off of him. The first draft of this was actually assembled in mid-2017. This was even before The Lost World was released. I think around that summer, the fifth Pirates of the Caribbean movie came out, and so that made me kind of want to write a pirate film. So I used the plot outline that Cade put down in those comics, and I wrote it into the first draft. You might be asking why I wrote the first draft for this before The Legend or The Lost World came out. Well, that's because what I used to do was write a bunch of spec scripts. At least that's what you're supposed to call them in the quote-unquote industry. God, I hate people who say that. In the industry? Shut up. Anyway, I'd write scripts just for fun. Sometimes I never get to finish them. Sometimes I would. But this was just one of those many scripts. But over the course of filming the Lost World and The Legend, I got really attached to the script, and I wanted to expand upon it more. I got pretty far into a first draft, but I just looked back and I wasn't too proud of it. And I figured that if I would try it again, then I would like it more, but I got 30 pages into a second draft and it just still wasn't working. I realized if I was going to make this work, it would have to be in a collaboration with another writer. That was kind of a scary thought, because I never worked with someone before in this capacity, but I was willing to give it a shot. So I contacted Eli Hutchinson, the voice actor of Stafford, and he was all for it. I'll go more in depth into the specifics of what we did later, because there's some stuff here I want to get to. But basically, we completed the final draft we were both happy with, and it was more or less ready to go. While I did really like the screenplay that we assembled, I was afraid that it would never get filmed. I had just 3 months left of high school left to go at that time, and I was afraid with college on the horizon that I wouldn't get to film this. But then a little thing called COVID-19 happened. Yeah, the whole country was in lockdown, and I decided that it was now or never. So I said, to hell with it, I'm going to film this anyway, and here we are now. With that whole spiel out of the way, we can finally talk about the film. This stuff in Baird here was filmed pretty early on. I want to say late June 2020. And, oh boy, you can tell it's pretty early on. I had still not learned my lesson from The Legend at that time. I didn't know that there was a little thing called lighting that existed. Which explains why a lot of these opening shots look like absolute ass. But thankfully the film does get better as it goes on. We're moving along pretty quickly here, so I'll try to cram in a few more things. The opening narration lines were redone a lot. I had Matt O'Mara, more about him later, redo these lines at least 3 times. He had actually got to a point where he got pretty frustrated at me. He asked, what the hell do you want me to do? And I didn't really have an answer for him. Yeah, some director I was. I guess when I wrote this, I kind of had it in the same vein as the opening of Braveheart, you know, where there's narration from Robert the Bruce where he introduces Scotland and all the characters, stuff like that. I wanted it to kind of set the stage, in a sense. But it's hard to do that with Matt's Ben Shapiro-esque voice. No offense, Matt, if you're listening to this. So I had him redo it at least 3 times, maybe more, and I just took the best takes from that and I assembled it into a large Frankenstein mesh of a narration. The buildings around Barrett here are something I'm not too proud of. The script called for a Irish-looking landscape, but none of this even remotely looks like it could be lived in. I guess it's appropriate for the finale since it's supposed to be old and decayed by that point, but not for this opening. It just doesn't look very good. Before he dies here, I should talk about Nate Sutton as William Davis. I met him through a very unique set of circumstances. Back when I was doing The Lost World, I released a trailer for it on my channel, which is the first video on my channel, actually. And he commented on there that he worked for a company in LA called Flicker Alley, which what they do is they restore old silent movies, and one of them was the Lost World. So I don't know how, but he somehow found the trailer through his recommended page, and he commented on there that he loved the voice act, and so The Lost World had been wrapped by that point, so I gave him the opportunity to voice in The Legend, and he gladly accepted. He voiced the character of Joe. What a great name. It was a small role, and he died pretty much as soon as he came on screen. So when I was trying to figure out who he'd voice in this film, he suggested he should voice William Davis because it would be a hilarious motif if every character he voiced for me died pretty much as soon as he was introduced. So I said, why not? And he got the part. At one point, I believe he was actually up for King Kahuka, but we switched that around. For this death scene right here, he forgot to record that the first time around, and so I had to go back and ask him to redo it. And so when he got around to submitting it, it was it was really hammy. Like it was a 4-minute take of him, I believe. He was just doing a bunch of death grunts, and it was pretty damn funny. I'll probably put some of that into the blooper reel when I eventually get around to doing that. But so I took the best takes from that, and I just combined them into this death scene here. Even then, it's still kind of cheesy, but it's not as bad as it was in that first take. Anyway, here's Admiral Smith. He's voiced by yours truly. I desperately wanted to get someone else to voice him. I wanted kind of an upper aristocratic voice for this character, not what I did. This was a character that literally no one wanted to voice. Even when I asked people to do him, they politely declined. So I just filled the role myself. My English accent is pretty atrocious, but he's not in the film for very long, so it's fine. Now this map shot that's coming up here, where we transition from Barrett to Hard Time, was just it was an absolute pain in the ass to do. We really did try to make this look good, but everything we did just made it look worse. So what I did originally for this was I got a 1700 style map of Europe from Google Images. Yeah, I know, really creative there. And I just used a transition effect on Premiere as a placeholder because I was going to come back to it later. But when the time came to actually do it, it just looked really janky, and everything we did just made it look even worse. So we just kind of had to bite the bullet, and it's in the film now. I still don't really like it, but whatever. What we originally wanted to do, and what was originally scripted, was that it was going to be kind of like Enemy at the Gates, where the map would show the armies moving, and you'd have the French be blue and the British be red, and you'd show this color swap, and the British would take control of these islands. But when we tried it, it just didn't look good at all. And it's going to be too complicated to do when there were multiple other effect shots that we wanted to get done, so we just kind of ditched that. This whole Siege of Hard Time sequence was a absolute bitch to film. I put it off for so long because I wasn't really sure how I was going to do it. Originally, when we faded in, there was going to be a panning shot where it would swoop around the fort and it would show the British firing at them. But when I tried to do that, it just looked really janky. So I just settled for the first part of that, where it just showed the front of the fort, and that's in the film now. I remember that the file for this was absolutely huge. It was 15 gigabytes, I want to say. Yeah, and that's not even the biggest on the film. That just really gave me a sense of how huge this film was, and it was going to be like nothing I'd ever done before. Now, what's interesting is how this whole war subplot came to be. Originally, in the first couple of drafts I did, there was no war at all. It was just Stafford kind of doing his own thing, and the pirates were doing their own thing. And there was really not a whole lot at stake. In fact, the whole reason why Stafford wanted to find the Kraken in the first place was to avoid a war with France. Yeah, kind of anticlimactic there, isn't it? So to add a bit more meat to the story, I wrote in that these two powers were at war, and Britain was doing pretty well, but they were suffering some setbacks, and that would prompt Stafford to want to pursue his boyhood dream of finding Davy Jones's locker. I actually wrote a whole backstory about why they were at war, but Britain was going to conquer a couple islands and that was going to really piss off France. But then Eli wrote in his notes for the third draft, it doesn't matter, those are his exact words. And he was absolutely right. It didn't matter. All that the audience needed to know was that there was a war, and that's it. There's still a remnant of that in the narration about the islands being conquered, but that's pretty much it. And no, there are no islands in the English Channel, I just made that up. This whole battle sequence here in the woods was a pretty late addition. This wasn't actually in the original script. I just thought I could add a bit more to the hard time battle, and so I thought, what if there was a cavalry charge? I thought that'd be pretty cool, because a cavalry charge is not something you typically associate with a high seas adventure film. So I shot this completely improvised sequence in around May of 2021, I want to say, and it turned out pretty good. I actually think this is a highlight of the film. It gives a huge Barry Lyndon vibe, doesn't it? You get to see here that the British are not a stormtrooper-like enemy. They are actually a threat to be reckoned with. Of course, the tactics aren't accurate to what would have been done in 1725, but there's already a fictional war that I wrote here, so who cares? It's a film with a bunch of islanders and a huge kraken. Is historical accuracy really your biggest concern? There were a few bits of this I had to cut out because it was just taking too long to get to Stafford finding the map. I believe there was a shot of a British soldier like losing his leg or something, like due to a cannonball. I don't know. I might put that back into the deleted scenes once I get around to doing that. That's always the tricky part of doing action sequences is when is too much too much. You know, you can't have these scenes go on for a long period of time because the audience is just going to get bored. So you have to kind of determine which is necessary to keep and what you have to cut out. Unfortunately, that becomes kind of a problem later on. I kind of got too attached to these sequences and I didn't want to cut a bit out. So that final battle goes on for really long. We'll get to that when we get to it, but looking back, there's a lot I wish I removed to make the film more tighter, because I think it's a bit too long. Let me talk about this El Dorado Fortress set here. This was a pain to get. I mean, any vintage LEGO set is hard to come by, but this one especially. I guess this was supposed to be like one of the rarest ones out of the 1989 LEGO Pirate line, which means the prices were sky high. That's part of the reason why this sequence was filmed so late, because it just took a while to get this. Eventually I found a generous seller and he got it to me for less than $250, so that was great. Sorry to go off on another tangent here, but this is by far the most expensive movie I've ever done. Thankfully all my voice actors are volunteers and so is my VFX crew, so I didn't have to pay them. But I did have to fork over a considerable amount of cash to acquire these sets. It wasn't easy, but I wanted to give this film a more vintage looking feel, because this is an unpopular opinion, but I just like the way the vintage Legos look. If you're like me, you grew up watching these Lego animations in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and they always use those classic yellow heads, and so I wanted to do that here. The legend kind of mix and match vintage with new, and I wanted to give this film a more distinctive look. And I think that succeeded. I think it is really nostalgic for a lot of people. God, I have skipped over a lot, haven't I? I'll talk about Eli more in a bit when we get to the Stafford exposition scene, but for now let's talk about Admiral Smith and his death scene. This moment got reworked a few times. Like I mentioned previously, there was no war in these earlier drafts, so Admiral Smith died of a illness. It was never specified what that was, but this was actually the first time that he was introduced, so it wasn't really impactful. Not that Admiral Smith is a character that you're supposed to like or anything, but you're supposed to understand how much this impacts Stafford and how this alters the course of the entire story. So I reworked it to where he got shot leading men in the battle, which I thought was a lot better. Eli actually wrote a version of this where Stafford choked Smith with a pillow because Smith said, "You will never be Admiral." Essentially, right out of Gladiator, where Commodus kills Richard Harris. That was one of the few times that I overruled Eli. I thought that was way too early to show Stafford's descent into madness. I thought it would be more interesting if we slowly saw that process. You know, what is one willing to do to preserve their legacy? So I overruled him and I just wrote it where Smith dies of his wounds. Overall, I think it works a whole lot better this way, and it takes Stafford kind of on a journey. Not a good journey, mind you, but a journey where he transforms as a character. God, these coughs here are something I'm not too proud of. I really hammed it up here, didn't I? I recorded all of Smith's dialogue in one sitting. It took about 10 minutes, maybe. Contrast that with my other voice actors who were doing this for years. I did this for less than 10 minutes. And you can tell because my performance is pretty bad. Something I was kind of worried about when I was assembling the film was that we weren't getting the Gabriel quick enough. I thought it was a bit late to introduce a main character, but then I remembered A New Hope with Luke Skywalker. He's introduced like 20 minutes into the movie, so it's not totally out of left field, I suppose. Will Hunt Harbor was a lot of fun to film. I guess that's mainly because I love the Imperial Trading Post set so much. It's my second favorite LEGO set behind Fort Legorado. I like the Eldorado Fortress, it was just a pain to get this. It was annoying because when I was looking at these sets at the time, you had to bid on them, you couldn't actually buy them. So it got really frustrating because I lost a lot of auctions this way, and I finally got one. It was just in the nick of time. There was like 3 seconds left to go, but I finally got a model, and this is what you see in the film. Originally, this was edited with the Southampton track from Titanic, but then I kind of had an epiphany. I said, that would be way too recognizable, wouldn't it? So I changed it to the On to Charleston track from The Patriot, which is a film I ended up taking a lot from. Okay, now I'll talk about the voice actors here. This is Matt O'Mara, he plays Gabriel, and he's a damn good filmmaker. I actually met him through Liam Bilski, who was supposed to voice Redbeard, but we'll get to him later. And he made a film called A Deadly Memory, I believe that's what it was called, and I was just so impressed with it, I said, what the hell, and I asked him if he wanted the voice, and he was all for that. He's like a legit filmmaker now, like he's out in New Mexico, he's doing some shit with the History Channel, I think, and I think he got a gig on HBO Max, but I could be wrong. Yeah, so he's definitely going places. His latest film, Beautiful Missing People, was actually released to Amazon Prime, which is just, frankly amazing. He has a YouTube channel called Motif Productions, and he just makes some wonderful stuff on there. Yeah, so Matt was just an absolute pleasure to work with. Finding him was an extreme stroke of luck, and he very well might not have been in the film. Oscar Johnson, who plays Benjamin Willingham, he was actually going to play Gabriel at one point. I decided Matt would be a much better fit because Oscar sounded way too old. I don't know why, but he had more of a rough pirate voice in him, not really the youthful spirit that I wanted for Gabriel. Which is ironic because I think Oscar and I are roughly the same age, but I could be wrong. We'll talk about Oscar more later on when we get to the Willingham character. Another fun fact about Matt is that I actually had him audition for Sin-K at one point. While both auditions were very good, it was clear that he was a much better fit for Gabriel. Matt was just a trooper. He had a lot of lines. But he was happy to do it, and God bless him. I've talked about Matt way too much here. I should probably talk about some of the other voice actors. Christopher here is played by Braden Crowlis. You might remember him from playing Union Soldier 9 in The Legend. He was one of the people that I cast really early on. Even when writing the initial drafts, I knew that I wanted him for Christopher. I can still remember in the summer of 2019, him and I were at a local pool, and I pitched him on this whole idea, and he was sold right away. What's funny is that he actually really didn't like playing this character too much. He said to me that Christopher is pretty boring because he's just kind of the supportive friend, and in a way he's right, that's really his main purpose. What's really funny is that both him and Matt wanted to put on accents for the characters. They both said that doing this in an American accent sounded really weird, and I don't blame them, it is kind of weird. Because they're doing a dialect that wouldn't exist until probably after the War of 1812, maybe. Even that's a bit too early. But I shut them both down because what I wanted to do was have the heroes talking American accents and the villains talking British accents. Sort of similar to what Star Wars did, where all the Imperials have these upper-class British voices and all the rebels have these classic rough American voices. I wanted to do something like that, but obviously there's gray area with Redbeard with his pirate voice, and Mr. Stone, he's British, so kind of failed that one, but whatever. Before he disappears here, I'd like to talk about the dock foreman. He's voiced by Adam Blummer. Meeting him was a very, and I mean very, chance encounter. We met in the fall of 2020 when I was doing my first semester of college online during the whole COVID year, and we had to do an introduce yourself activity. The whole, my name is blah blah blah, and my hobbies include, etc., and so forth. So he posted his hobbies, and he actually posted his YouTube channel, which I thought was really interesting, and so I replied to him and said, hey, I'm also a content creator, and we hit it off right away. He runs a channel called Jerry the Afro-Man, which is very much a Filthy Frank-inspired character, and we filmed a lot of really funny stuff together. We filmed a Ghost Hunter spoof, which I think is one of the funniest things that he's ever done, and we also filmed a Frogman video, which was kind of a parody of the whole Finding Bigfoot stuff. Actually, it was while we were filming the Frogman video in my garage that I had Adam come downstairs to record lines. Actually, it was on that same day that Holden recorded his lines for Barnett. We'll get to him in a bit, since he's coming up here. But yeah, Adam voiced the Doc Foreman. He's very similar to the Warden Garrett character from The Legend. You know, he's kind of a gruff-sounding authority figure. What's interesting is that Chris Major was actually supposed to voice him at one point. Chris Major being the voice actor for General Andrew in The Legend. He actually submitted lines for the Doc Foreman, but I just didn't think he sounded mean enough. So I had to recast him, and unfortunately he doesn't appear at all in this film. But at the end of the day, I think it was for the best. Adam just sounds much more like a angry car mechanic than Chris Major did, so there's that. God, we're moving really fast here. We're already on to the trio. I should probably talk about them here. So these three guys were in pretty much every draft I wrote. I just kind of thought it would be fun to get to know a few of the British soldiers and not have them be a faceless enemy, you know? And also, they're there to lighten the mood whenever Mr. Stone can't. The inspiration for these guys came from a couple different sources. They're, first and foremost, obviously based on the two soldiers from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, Murtaugh and Mulroy, I believe their names are. Those two were always my favorite characters in that franchise. I just loved how they were a running joke throughout that series, and they'd always pop up when you least expected them to. Like how in World's End, they're just there guarding the chest, which is hilarious to me. So I wanted to do something kind of like that, but I didn't want it to be too obvious that I was ripping off Pirates of the Caribbean, so I added in a third one. And with the addition of a third soldier came the second source of inspiration. I based a lot of the personality of these guys off of the three hyenas from The Lion King. You know, you have the one that's kind of the leader, and then you have the one that just can't talk at all, which is the Patrick role. So basically those were the main inspirations for those. Giles is played by Will Downing, who I met through Adam. And fun fact, he's actually the only voice actor that's from the UK in this entire production. Everyone else is an American putting on fake British accents. So Will is probably the only authentic one here. Casting him was pretty difficult. There were a few others I had in mind for the role, but there were none that could match the comedic timing that Will had, so he got the part. And he's just a blast to watch. It almost sounds like he has real chemistry with his characters, even though he's a full ocean away from us. I know that we're in the middle of the chase scene here, but I want to talk about Barnett and Patrick a bit. Barnett is played by Holden Meese, who previously voiced Dewey in The Legend. Holden was actually originally up for Hans, and you can see in the announcement video for this project, he says he's playing Hans. I had to recast him because his Dutch accent was just really silly. I don't know why I assumed he could pull that off, but lesson learned, I guess. He fits the Barnett role very well. He legitimately sounds like he's dim-witted, which is exactly what I wanted for the character. There are times where I think he forgets that he ever played this role. He always talks about Dewey and never about Barnett. But I think he did a fine job. His lines make me laugh the hardest, well, besides Mr. Stone, of course. And finally in this trio there's Patrick, who's voiced by me, yours truly. I added him in as a joke. I wasn't sure if he was going to really stick, because it was meant to be kind of a mockery of my own stutter, which is something that I'm kind of made fun of for a lot. And plus there aren't a lot of characters in movies that actually stutter, so I thought Patrick would be a welcome addition. I just kind of thought it would be humorous for the most powerful army in the world to have a soldier that stutters. That bit there where Patrick points his gun to Giles' head, that was actually inspired from a gag from The Mummy Returns. I just thought that bit was funny, so I wanted to pay homage to it in the film. Oh, I didn't really get to talk about Austin Kiefer much at all. I'll get to him later. I know that it's already passed, but I'll talk a bit about the chase scene here. That chase was filmed pretty early on. I want to say late 2020, maybe early 2021. And it was actually kind of challenging because the script just kind of said they run, you know, it didn't really specify where to. So I had to come up with these scenarios where they would go to and how they'd avoid soldiers. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but I think it's fine for what it is. And now we're on to the Seahawk here. This thing, my god, this was the hardest set to get. So the Imperial flagship, which is what the set's called, this thing goes for about $800 to $900, and that's being used. Not new, used. So that was way outside of our price range, so we tried our best to negotiate with some sellers on eBay. We talked to a guy who was willing to go as low as $700, which that wasn't going to work. But thankfully I found a Malaysian bootleg. Yeah, I know, it sounds weird, doesn't it? It was all fake Lego and the price was only $90. I was really skeptical of this because it seemed way too good to be true. But Elliot encouraged me to get it, so I did, and it came surprisingly less than 8 days, which is just insane timing because it's coming over from a whole nother country, so that was really fortunate for us. If I didn't tell you, you would have no idea it wasn't real Lego, so that was a real cost saver for us. Okay, now I can finally talk about Eli. I've waited far too long. Eli here plays Admiral Stafford. He previously voiced Travis in the Legend film, but this is by far the superior of those two roles. Him and I go back to the days of the Legend pre-production where I was still trying to cast people, and he luckily filled in the role of Travis. Not only did he voice Stafford, but he also helped write the script. We threw back and forth a lot of ideas, but eventually we came to a fourth and final draft that we both liked. It was really great collaborating with him because he's a very talented writer. I'd wager to say that the script was 75% me and 25% Eli. But that 25% is what made the movie. He was able to fine-tune all of the dialogue that wasn't working, and he was able to basically make the story flow better than what it otherwise would have. I'll go more into the specifics of what we changed in the scripts later on, but I want to talk a bit more about Eli here. For me personally, I think he's what makes the movie. Everyone I've talked to said that Stafford was a real standout, and that's great, because I was worried he was going to be a bit too one-dimensional. He was heavily inspired by the Colonel Tavington character in The Patriot. Eli plays this role 100% straight, and it leads to a really compelling character because he takes every line seriously. He always does a phenomenal job, and especially here, he shows his capabilities as an actor. I guess you might say he's the Daniel Day-Lewis of my films. To give you an idea of just how good of an actor this guy is, there was not a single retake with him. What usually happens for my voice actors is that I'll go through their lines and then I'll say, you know, that was good, but maybe we could do one more retake. But with Eli, there was not a single one of those. He nailed every single line, which that's something that just doesn't happen. No matter how good of an actor you are, you usually have to do at least one retake, but not with him. His performance here is just so great. It doesn't feel cartoonish, it doesn't feel overly evil, and the accent doesn't feel tacked on. It feels very authentic. Looking back, the one thing that bugs me about Stafford is his design. I chose the Draco Malfoy face deliberately because Jason Isaacs, the actor that plays Tavington, played Lucius Malfoy. The minifigure head for Lucius Malfoy just didn't feel quite evil enough, so I used the Draco Malfoy one instead. The head is not what bothers me. I think that's one of the more positive aspects. The thing that really bugs me is his torso. When I ordered the minifigures from eBay, the main officer was just dressed in that white coat, and I didn't really think much of it. But when I got the minifigures for Governor Lee and Broadside, I noticed that they had the red sleeves, and I just kind of slapped myself. I didn't realize that. Thankfully, I sort of corrected this mistake later on when he takes Governor Lee's jacket, but that was way too late. I think he looks a bit goofy in that white coat, but who am I to judge? I know that scene just ended there, but I want to talk about Tim Schill as Joffrey. Meeting Tim was also a very chance encounter. I met him in November, I think it was, of 2019, when I was doing auditions for Clue, which is the production my high school was doing. In case you're wondering, I got the part of Colonel Mustard. And we met during these auditions, and we hit it off right away. We formed a very good friendship. He actually understudied for Wadsworth, which is the part of the British butler. The guy who actually played Wadsworth was out for most of the rehearsals because he had to do some choir thing. I forget what it was. But anyway, Tim had to fill in for most of the time during rehearsal. And what struck me was just how good his British voice was. He really captured the butler voice quite well. It got to the point where it was legitimately jarring when the guy who played Wadsworth came back and Tim had to sit out because Tim was way too nice. Wadsworth is supposed to kind of be more of a mean, sarcastic character, but Tim just he was just smiling at every line, which really was more accurate for a butler type character. And I thought, hey, he understudies really well, why not ask him to be Joffrey? And so he was all for it, and he actually was the first voice actor to send in his lines. He sent them in April of 2020, just when the whole COVID lockdowns were happening. And he definitely sounds a part of a butler. The whole reason that Joffrey exists is just to give Stafford some dialogue to bounce off of. He really helps with Stafford giving all that exposition, because it kind of acts more as a conversation rather than pages on a script. The name Joffrey is actually kind of interesting. It comes from the very shitty animated Titanic movie, the one where the octopus saves the Titanic. There's another one, yeah, there's two of them with a rapping dog, but this is the other one. The villain had a manservant named Jeffrey. I thought that name was really funny for like a butler character, so I put that into the script, but then I said that wouldn't quite work, so I changed his name to Joffrey to sound more upper class. And thankfully no one's complained, yet. Okay, now I'll talk about what's actually happening on the screen. This sequence of them in this prison cell was actually the first scene that was ever filmed for the movie. You can tell it's early on because the lighting in here is pretty atrocious. I actually, in post-production, I darkened this in Adobe Premiere. But even then, the lighting is still kind of obvious. I guess I'll talk about Redbeard here for a bit. Redbeard is portrayed by Jacob Fowley, who always does a tremendous job in whatever he does. I went on like a 10-minute tangent praising him in the Legend commentary, so I'll try to keep it to a minimum here, but basically, him and I have known each other for quite a number of years. We've collaborated on a multitude of projects. I voice acted for him in a couple of his stop motions. I didn't do particularly that great of a job, but I was happy to be in there anyway, and more happy that he considered me to be in them. Like Eli Hutchinson, he comes from a very extensive theater background, so naturally he nails every role he does, including this one. Now, originally Jacob was not actually supposed to play Redbeard. The part was originally selected to Liam Bilski, who played Warden Garrett in The Legend. He read the script and he was really interested in the Redbeard role, and he sent in a demo reel of him doing a Thomas Wake voice from The Lighthouse, and it was godly. It was the perfect amount of an old sea captain voice that I wanted, and he got the part. Unfortunately, I didn't have him record his lines right away. For some reason I waited. I don't know why I did that. But anyway, it was November of 2020 when I finally asked him to record his lines, and he just kind of danced around the question. I was actually kind of pissed off because he was kind of ignoring me. He's like, yeah, I'll get around to it, and he never did. But what I later found out is that he was going through some very bad mental health times, and he just couldn't be in my project, and I felt terrible because no doubt I was pushing him over the edge, and I had no idea what he was going through. But thankfully we're still good friends, and we talk to each other quite a bit on Instagram, so that's good. But anyway, his departure from the film left a huge hole in casting. There was this huge character and there was no one to voice him. I sought out a bunch of different people who could do decent pirate impressions. There were a few that I seriously considered, but most of them wanted to be paid, which I couldn't do. But thankfully an angel came in the form of Jacob Fowley. I was telling him about my problem and he said, "You do realize that pirates are my favorite thing ever, right?" And he really wanted to audition for it, and I said, I don't know, but we can see. And he sent an audition and he was great. I hate to say this, but admittedly he does not do as great of a sea captain voice as Liam did, but there are very few that could. Jacob kind of plays him more as a adventurous sort of character, which is not really what he was in the original script. In the original script he was supposed to be kind of more of a wise mentor figure, but Jacob kind of took a different spin on the character, which I think benefited the film. Both Liam and Jacob gave two very different performances, and I think both of them would have worked great, but I think Jacob worked better for this particular movie. Hopefully there'll be another project where I can use Liam's sea captain voice in. Here's Governor Lee, voiced by Jack Miller. I'll talk more about him later on in a scene with Stafford, but what I was afraid of here is that his introduction would be very abrupt. Like it just kind of comes out of nowhere. And in a sense that is kind of true. But thankfully it's not too distracting. I mean, not every character needs to have a elaborate introduction scene, so it's fine. I'll talk about Austin Kiefer's Broadside here. I first met Austin when I was doing The Lost World. After seeing his Lego Gettysburg video, I sought him out and asked if he wanted the voice in Lost World, and he was all for it. He was probably one of the only few good things about that movie, but that's a story for another day. What I really wanted him to do was voice in The Legend, but he had other commitments to do, unfortunately. So those plans kind of fell through. But thankfully, he was very excited to voice in the Pirates film. He was considered for 3 roles. He was going to be either Giles, Mr. Stone, or Broadside. Early on, he was a real strong contender for Mr. Stone, but despite Austin's great comedic timing, I felt that he was much better suited for Broadside. He has just such a commanding voice that it would be insane not to use him for Broadside. So thankfully, he voiced Broadside, and he's very great in that role. His performance was actually so great that it actually kind of changed the character a bit. Originally, Broadside was not sympathetic at all. He was just supposed to be kind of another evil henchman. But after I made the choice to axe off Governor Lee, there was kind of a void of who was going to challenge Stafford. So I wrote Broadside into filling that role, and it just really wasn't working. It seemed kind of out of character for him. Thankfully, my fears were laid to rest when Austin turned in his voice lines. He played Broadside as a much more sympathetic character than what I ever intended him to be. It's really amazing how an actor can completely transform a character into something totally different. Austin has actually started to kind of delve more into filmmaking. He's produced a couple of shorts which are really good. There was one he made that was called The Deserter, which was a Civil War short film, and it was just fantastic. So he's a guy that can both act and direct, which those are a pretty rare combo. It was just a pleasure to work with him, and his performance really shines through later on in the movie. Here's the escape from Whale Hunt Harbor sequence. This was just a blast to film and edit. It comes at just the perfect time, because after all of that heavy exposition talk, the audience kind of needs a break. And thankfully this scene kind of fills that void. It's a really fun escape scene. Originally, the scene with the trio here was going to be drawn out a lot more. Gabriel was supposed to keep them distracted as Christopher and Redbeard climbed up the ship, and there was going to be a few shots where Christopher would knock over a railing or something, and Giles would say, "What's that?" And Gabriel would keep him occupied, and there'd be some back and forth banter, but it really just wasn't working, and it kind of slowed down the film. So that was one of the things that I kind of axed out of the original script. Even when I finally filmed the scene, there were a few bits I ended up taking out. I might put them back in for a deleted scene montage, but I don't know. They're so incredibly minor. That's a problem with a lot of the quote-unquote deleted scenes from this movie. There's just a lot of 5-second bits that were taken out to make it flow better, and it's not really worth making a video of a sequence that's basically the same as a movie with just like 5 more seconds. So, I don't know, we'll see what happens, but it'll be an interesting video when I get around to it. Now, the shots of them on board the Barracuda were just a pain in the ass to film. If you own any LEGO pirate ship, you'll know the decks are very small and it's just impossible to place a camera in there. So what I had to do was completely tear down the Black Seas Barracuda set and basically remake it on a gray base plate, which took a very long time. And what I had in mind when I was doing that was to film all the action set pieces that take place on board the Barracuda, and also some various shots of the characters walking around and such. But then when I filmed those scenes, I realized, oh shit, I'll need exterior shots of the ship, and so I'd have to reassemble it and then tear it back down again because I'll need additional shots. Yeah, kiddos, this is why you storyboard, so you avoid problems like these. Something that's interesting about the original scripts is that the dockmen didn't rise up and come aboard with them. It was originally conceived that only Gabriel, Christopher, and Redbeard were going to commandeer the ship. Then I kind of looked back on that and said, that's a little much, isn't it? And plus, it becomes even more of a problem later on when you have that action set piece with the British ships, and then the French come in, and it would just be a nightmare if only 3 people, well, 4 I guess if you include Mr. Stone, but he's pretty useless. So that was a good change. It made the battle scene a bit more realistic, I guess. There's a shot that's coming up here that I really don't like. One of the dockmen takes his musket and shoots a British officer in the face. Actually, it should be coming up, I think, right there, yeah. Elliot actually didn't do the VFX for this particular sequence. That was done by someone else. The work was very good, but I didn't like that skull shot, but I was actually in the minority. Everyone else seemed to love that shot. It was actually one of the few times in this entire film that I sort of compromised my creative vision, if you will. It was something that all of the VFX artists loved, so I just decided to keep it in. I guess it was a good call, because at every screening of this I do, people seem to love that shot. I just thought it looked a bit fake looking, but I guess I'm alone in that regard. This little bit of the Barracuda sort of crashing into the dock here was one that I wish I expanded upon. I think it's a bit too abrupt in the final edit. In the shooting script, it was actually much more of a big deal. There was going to be triumphant music, and it would really be drawn out. Even with that said, I wish I filmed a couple more shots of this, because it kind of feels a bit too quick. Even the music kind of cuts off abruptly. I don't know, it's just kind of something that bugs me there. This little scene with the trio here was almost removed. In fact, it was very close to being cut out of the film entirely. But I figured we don't see him again for a while, so it's best to have this little conclusion, I guess. But looking back, I do kind of wish I cut this out, because it interrupts the flow of the pacing. But it's fine the way it is, I suppose. This panning shot of the Barracuda was originally much longer. In fact, I think it clocked in over 30 seconds, I think. But it just didn't look good. It felt really janky, so I kind of kept just the beginning part of it, and then I cut to Redbeard saying, Christopher, get a man on the wheel. I think the edit was good choice because it kind of keeps the pace tight. And also, you're mentioning Benjamin Willingham here to the audience for the first time, so it's best if you don't distract him with a David Lean type style long take. That's definitely something I learned my lesson from in The Legend, is not to rely so much on long takes because they're just kind of boring. Unless you're shooting a live action movie, a long take is something that should be typically avoided in a stop motion because it just takes more effort and it makes the audience more aware that this is a movie. Because more often than not, they'll be looking at a blank frame for upwards of 20 seconds. It led to a lot of very boring and frankly awkward shots in The Legend. I naively thought that people would be so invested in the story and characters that they wouldn't care necessarily about the cinematography. But that's not really true, as I've come to learn. I still stand by my statement previously that story and characters matter the most, but I think having good cinematography definitely does help in conveying those story and characters. So I made sure to make the shots in this movie seem more dynamic, if you will, than what they were in The Legend. The Legend had a lot of just static shots, while this movie has a lot of movement involving the camera, which I think benefits greatly to masking how terrible the animation is. Of course, not every shot in here is fantastic, but I think overall it's much better cinematography than what it was in The Legend. Something we also improved a lot upon was the lighting. Now, this is going to sound extremely hypocritical, but I don't like the technical aspects of film. That's kind of insane to say, I know, because film is a technical art. But my interests more lie with storytelling and conveying the story through editing the images, not necessarily arranging the camera to make sure it looks good, which is something that's not an example you want to follow. This is why I think I'd be a terrible live-action director, because I wouldn't care about the most important stuff. You know, making sure that your shot actually looks good is probably the most important aspect of filmmaking, but I don't know, this never really interested me, which is a really apparent problem on The Legend. Before this movie, I only filmed with one lamp. It was never really a problem with The Lost World because the black and white filter kind of hid the graininess, but when doing color, that image starts to get really grainy. You can definitely see that in this film too, because early on I was still using that one lamp system, but then I considered, hey, what if we use two lamps? What if that would make the shot look better? So thankfully I implemented this, and there were two lamps. You're supposed to film with three lamps, I suppose, the three-point lighting system, but whatever. This is Mermerica, goddammit! I'm gonna make my film all I want. If you're still listening to this, I pity you. Okay, let's talk about everyone's favorite character here, Mr. Stone. This character was in every draft I wrote, and he was there from the first conceptions of it. Even in the original comics that Kate wrote, there was always a more comedic butler character. Mr. Stone is probably my favorite character in any of my films. He just has so much personality. I think he adds a lot of heart to the Heart of the Seas. I'm dying alone. He could probably be cut from the main narrative and you wouldn't miss a ton, but he's just so much fun. The inspirations for this character were, well, really there was two inspirations. The one was Jar Jar Binks. Yeah, I know, it's not something I really want to take inspiration from. Say what you want about that character, but I do like the idea of having a more comedic character accompany heroes on a larger-than-life quest. And the second inspiration was Jonathan from The Mummy. He'd always provide a great comedic wit in those movies, so I wanted to kind of replicate that. I think a lot of the charm for Mr. Stone comes from the voice actor, Jaden Frank. I remember that I thought it was going to be really difficult casting this character. I wasn't really sure who was going to be able to provide the character with the comic effect I wanted. I considered Austin Kiefer for a bit, because he has excellent comedic timing on his videos, but I thought he was better suited for Broadside, and so they kind of left a vacant place for Mr. Stone. I thought, who could fill this role? And then Jaden read over the script, and he said, Mr. Stone is the best part in it. I'd like to audition for him. And I said, really? And he was enthusiastic about it, and so he got the part. Jaden really enjoyed voicing him too. It's become a running joke between us and my channel, I guess, too, that he's the embodiment of Christ, and he's kind of become a running joke like Dewey was for The Legend, except actually funny. Jaden was just born for this part. I remember that I was initially hesitant because Jaden was kind of more known for serious roles like Lieutenant Thomas and General Seymour from my OLSD video. but he proved he had a great comedic talent, and it was just a pleasure working with him. Something that is actually interesting is that Mr. Stone was originally conceived to be a more older character. The humor would come from his quiet sarcasm, but when Jaden took over the character, he had kind of a larger-than-life personality, and so I kind of scaled Mr. Stone's age back a bit. When I wrote the screenplay, I always pictured Mr. Stone having the Arthur Banks head from my theater projects in high school, but thankfully he just has that mustache now. Okay, one last bit about Mr. Stone and then we'll move on. The scene of him in the marketplace was actually not in the original scripts. He was supposed to be introduced just below the hold, but I thought that was a bit too late to be introducing a character. So his introduction was kind of bumped up to make him more active in the story. Because he just kind of came out of nowhere, like here's this drunk British guy in the bottom of our ship, but when you introduce that earlier scene, he's more familiar to the audience and they can say, oh, it's that guy. Instead of them saying, who's that, you know? Okay, here's the Governor Lee and Stafford scene. Governor Lee is voiced by Jack Miller. He's frankly, just a fantastic actor. I don't think he's ever done any acting outside of my films, which is a shame because he's very talented. Also, fun fact, he's the only voice actor that's appeared in all three of my mainline films. He was Summer Lee and John Roxton in The Lost World, and he was Master William in The Legend. Well, he was also Jones, that's right. But those were all minor roles, and he never really had a chance to show off his talents. So I sent him the script, and he was interested in the part of Stafford. I was already in talks with Eli around that time, and so I said, why don't you try out for Governor Lee? And so he nailed the audition, and so I went to go record his lines. What's interesting about Jack is that all of his lines were recorded in less than a half hour. It sounds crazy, but it didn't take us that long. The only thing that really ate up time was just trying to find a voice for the character. It was a unique recording with Jack because I actually can go over to his house and he lives near to me, unlike my other voice actors that live sometimes hundreds of miles away from me, and in some cases a whole ocean away. So it was great with Jack because we could both sit down and have one-on-one talks about how his character would sound like. Because normally with my other voice actors, I'll give them a direction of what I want them to sound like, but I won't hear what that character sounds like until they send me the lines. But with Jack, we could work on the voice and improve it. He originally tried a few takes kind of using a Emperor Palpatine-esque voice, but that was kind of cheesy, so we opted to go for the more gentlemanly British voice instead, which works tremendously, I think, in the film. His main inspiration was General Cornwallis from The Patriot. Well, I shouldn't say from The Patriot, because General Cornwallis was a real-life person, but whatever. So basically I told him just kind of to mimic the voice that Tom Wilkinson did in the movie, and so he did that well, I think. Another fun fact about Governor Lee is that he was originally envisioned to be much older. He's already a bit old in the film, but even more so in the original script. I envisioned him actually having the Count Dooku head from the Attack of the Clones line that came out in around 2002. And also, that would be kind of a humorous gag, because, Governor Lee and Christopher Lee. I don't know, I thought that was kind of funny. But I thought that the Admiral face from the Pirates line would be much more appropriate for this character. It would kind of help with the Pirates aesthetic of the film. Eli and Jack play off really well together, despite them not actually being in the same room. Like, it sounds like there's genuine history and tension between them, even though they're 100 miles away. This scene feels like it's right out of a stage play, and I just love that about it. You have these two magnificent actors going toe-to-toe with each other. And this little beat here where Governor Lee takes the map and throws it into the fireplace was actually not in the original script. This was an idea that Eli had because we felt that Governor Lee didn't have enough reason to believe this expedition. Like, Stafford was pitching him on this and he didn't have anything to show for it. And so we felt that the turnaround of him saying, alright, you have my permission to go, was a bit weak. So he added this moment where the map would glow when it was thrown into the fireplace. And we added kind of a supernatural element to it too. The sounds you hear from the fireplace are actually from a supposed recording of hell in Siberia. I know, spooky. So that really gives a sense of mystery to this map and what it is. Originally, everything about the plot was revealed in the Seahawk cabin scene with Stafford and Joffrey, but Eli kind of felt that was a bit rushed and he wanted a bit more mystery to it. He said, let's milk this a bit. We can get more mystery out of this, and it'll make the audience follow along too, and they're figuring this out while the characters are as well. Because it's just not interesting when the characters already know everything about the map and the shard. So we saved most of the exposition for the throne room scene with King Kahuka, because we felt that was a more appropriate place to put it at. And it greatly helps with scenes like this, so you don't have to repeat information again. I remember particularly this scene was rewritten a bunch. One of the main problems that the first drafts had was that everyone tended to repeat themselves a bunch. Like, the audience would already know this information, but characters would have to re-explain themselves in order to get certain characters to be on their side. For example, in Stafford's case, you can't write him just saying, I'm going on an exposition to find the locker of Davy Jones. You have to have Governor Lee saying, okay, what the hell are you doing here? You know, it's easy to say, and then Stafford goes to Governor Lee, but you have to actually write out a conversation. Which that was probably the most difficult part of those rewrites, was just making sure you don't repeat yourself a bunch. Because if you do, then what's the point of having it in the movie? Also, what I wanted to do with that scene was make sure that the characters were moving around a bunch, kind of like what you would do with theater. Because in the legend, when table scenes like this, they're just kind of sitting there. It's not really that interesting to look at. So I made sure that Governor Lee would get up and kind of move around, so it's not just looking at still frames the entire time. Okay, I'll move on to this scene here, I suppose. The interior for the Black Seas Barracuda was a huge hassle to build. The original set from 1989 has a little captain's cabin space, or the captain's cabin space, but it's so tiny that you can't film a scene in there, so you have to tear it apart. And tearing apart a set from 1989 is not something you really want to do, but in this case we kind of had to. So I took a gray base plate and I just kind of took apart the stern section of the Barracuda, and I built this cabin here. Now in real life, I suppose this cabin wouldn't be that big. It would probably just be a room, but you need to have a dinner scene in here to get this exposition out to your audience. Speaking of exposition, let's talk about this scene a bit. Yay. This admittedly was a challenge to edit, because I remember the music was just really tricky to put in there. None of the tracks I wanted lasted long enough, so I had to combine a bunch of them. I used a lot of tracks from the Waterworld soundtrack. It's a very shitty movie, but has a really great soundtrack, more right so than it really has been. That's also a problem in this film, is that tracks of music that I select don't last long enough, and so I'll have to kind of do a fade in to the next track. And sometimes there's a jump in audio that gets really noticeable. But that doesn't happen a ton, but it is kind of noticeable in this scene. This scene was rewritten a bunch too, because it originally went into more of the lore of Captain Redbeard, because he was supposed to be this really famed pirate, and the original script went into more detail about that. But Eli and I decided we just had to keep the bare essentials, because while this stuff of Redbeard's grand tales were very cool, it just wasn't necessary to advance the story along. I'm sure that would be a great prequel movie, The Adventures of Redbeard and Willingham, and you could have a climax where they run into Captain Graves. I don't know, I think it'd be cool. One of the best contributions that Eli made to the script, and one that I think frankly saved the movie, was that the stories of Stafford and the pirate crew were now intertwined. Because originally in the scripts, Stafford was out doing his own thing looking for Davy Jones's locker, and the pirates were just off trying to form a crew to, I don't know, do pirate stuff. And they'd have a chance encounter at Blackwater, and then they'd find out about this quest that Stafford was on. But the stories just didn't feel connected. They didn't feel like they were going anywhere. Why should we be invested in the pirates when they don't have a clear goal? So Eli made the great decision to have them both be looking for the same thing. It adds a great deal more stakes too, because the pirates aren't really aware of just how powerful this locker is, and it kind of leads more to the Gabriel's character arc too, because he starts off not really caring about anyone but himself, but then he remembers his boyhood, and he vows to make sure that no one has to experience what he did. So overall, it just led to more interesting relationships with the characters. What's interesting is that right after this scene where Gabriel kind of blows up about Stafford being mentioned, there was a scene I filmed where Joffrey and Stafford were in the Seahawk just kind of chilling out, and they would discuss their plans, but it just really wasn't necessary for the story, because all this was information that we already knew. And it just kind of slowed down the edit. I think that transition from the window to Broadside's fleet was much smoother. I'll probably put that into the deleted scenes video when that eventually comes out. Here's the sequence that was just known as Scene 8. Yeah, I know, what a lovely title. This took by far the longest to assemble out of any of the other scenes in the movie. That final battle took pretty long too, but not as long as this one. Because you have to cut back and forth between ships, and you gotta have dialogue. It's just a mess. This was actually a sequence that I actually almost considered cutting out, because we later on have this sequence where the French and British battle each other at Blackwater, so I felt this was a bit redundant. But Eli actually liked this scene. He said it was a much needed action set piece because we just gone through all these scenes of characters just talking, so it was kind of used to give more excitement, I guess, in a way. I think that now is a good time to talk about Elliot and all of his contributions to this production. I just want to go on the record in saying that without Elliot, this film would have not been possible. He did wonders with all the VFX, and he made my vision come to life. There were a few things I was worried about when I showed him the script, but he said, "Don't worry about it, I'm going to make it happen." Well, overall, there were 3 VFX artists. Eventually, those 2 had to drop out, and so by the end, it was just him doing all this work. And I felt terrible because he was doing all this by himself. But he got it done eventually, and he went above and beyond in some regards. He did a lot of stuff for The Legend and Olusty, but he really stepped up his game here. And you can especially tell that in this sequence here, because there's all these kills and blood. And actually, speaking of the blood, that's something that was actually not intended, I guess. Well, people were always going to get killed, but not at the levels of Quentin Tarantino, you know. That's something that kind of evolved over production there. He just went to town on these kills. There's one shot that he really went more than he should have. There's a shot where a British soldier gets torn in half and his torso falls down in the water. Like, that shot wasn't originally meant to do that, but he just did it anyway. There were only a few shots that I told him to tone down, but that was really about it. What I usually do with Elliot is I give him creative freedom to pretty much do whatever he wants. I give him some direction, like I'll say, I want a blood at this watermark, but that's pretty much it. The VFX portions are his child, and he goes to town on them. I can't sing his praises enough, and he deserves way more recognition than what he gets. He actually has a production company called Longshot Digital. He's made several live-action shorts, and they're all very good. It's just amazing to see Elliot evolve from the days of The Lost World, where he voiced Mr. Miller, and then going on to do all the VFX for this film. Something that he also does is voice Lieutenant Bolton. It's a minor role, but it was good to give him a part in the film, especially since he sat out The Legend. Now, despite what he might claim, I actually think he's a pretty good actor. Oh, I forgot, let me talk about these lights here. Something that Elliot will do is that he'll enhance scenes in ways that he sees fit. Like, for example, he'll think that the lamps on ship should be glowing, and so he'll do that. Something that I was never too big on in the scene was how later on there's kind of some sword fighting that happens on the decks. The way that the British soldiers just kind of swing onto the ship with the ropes there just makes them seem like they're out of a Errol Flynn movie or something, or almost like they're at a Universal stunt show. I don't know, it just kind of felt cartoony. I wasn't sure just how much of the on-deck fighting we needed, because later on there's this whole elaborate set piece of the Barracuda, and the crew will have this life or death struggle against the pretty much the whole British Navy, so I just wasn't sure to go too extreme here. I think it lasts just long enough, but it kind of runs the risk of being a little repetitive. But thankfully it's cut short by the arrival of the French here. The French are kind of the deus machina of the film, aren't they? They appear right when you need them to. That's one thing I do kind of regret about this final draft, is that the French weren't really that developed. In earlier drafts, they were actually major characters. There was actually a cut character called Governor Petit. Tit. God, I'm 12. And he'd basically be the counter for Governor Lee, like he'd be the leader of the French forces. But unfortunately, he didn't really survive past the first draft. I just kind of felt the French only needed one notable commander, so that kind of went to Captain Javier. He was actually supposed to be pronounced Captain Javert, you know, kind of like Javert from Les Miserables. But Kiefer pronounced it Javier, so his name is Javier now. He's the only character that says his name, so it's fine. He's not a major character anyway. But going back to kind of the earlier drafts, the French had much bigger roles. Actually, Captain Javier was supposed to be the descendants of one of Davy Jones's crew, and he'd know where the locker was, and that would lead the French on this expedition, and they'd be sort of third-party rivals, if you will. But when the decision was made to add in a war, their parts were cut down substantially. Like, they're hardly in the film anymore, actually. They're just not that major of characters to really care about, so their parts had to be cut down. But I think I might have cut them down a bit too much, because they're at the point where they have basically no personality left. I mean, we know nothing about them or why they're fighting this war, so we're given really no insight into what their characters are like. but I suppose it's not that big of a deal because they're not major characters, so it's fine. Some of these ship shots here where the camera is kind of overhead and you see them moving, that's not something I'm particularly proud of. These were kind of the first times that we were going into the concept of motion tweens, and we'd take an overhead photo of a ship on a green slate, and then I'd send that to Elliot, and he'd crop that out, and he'd put that into Adobe After Effects, and he'd add a motion tween to it, and then he could copy and paste and add as many ships as he wanted to a particular shot. He got pretty good at it later on, but in these early scenes you can kind of tell we're just kind of figuring it out. Those are basically the only VFX shots that I'm unhappy with in this entire movie. I think that everything else looks great, and that's due to Elliot's great talent with this VFX stuff. This was not like The Legend where he only did some of the shots and I had to do the rest of them. He basically did pretty much everything, which benefited greatly to the rest of the film because now it has more of a distinctive look. And there's now consistency with the quality for VFX. Going into this little scene here, there was actually quite a bit of difficulty in figuring out how Stafford would get the Blackwater, because we needed him to get there for that duel with Gabriel, but we just couldn't figure out how to do that. And Eli actually came up with the idea of they're running low on supplies. And I thought that Lieutenant Bolton could deliver that message to Stafford, and that could sort of develop their relationship a bit more, and kind of lead into Bolton's ultimate hesitancy to fire on the Islanders towards the ending of that whole battle sequence there. The scene kind of leads to a continuity error here, because it's clearly the morning after that big battle, but Redbeard says they're close to Blackwater, so why are they taking a whole extra day to get there, you know? It's just that stuff you don't really think about. I don't know. So now we're moving on to the Blackwater sequence of this film. This approach to Blackwater was actually something that was a bit tricky to figure out. What I did was I basically just filmed a blue slate and a black background, and I just would figure I'd put something there later. But when it came time to actually edit that sequence together, we didn't know what we were going to do. Thankfully, Elliot worked his magic, and we have this sequence here. It's amazing how he just created this entire city out of thin air. The script described Blackwater as just being basically a more rundown version of Lake Town from The Hobbit, and what I wanted to kind of convey was that it was slowly sinking into the ocean. So I tried to put seaweed on buildings and kind of put rocks in various buildings to convey that it's kind of crumbling down. Blackwater is supposed to be kind of in the last couple of years or so of its life here. I like to think that maybe like 50 years ago this was a respectable little trading outpost, but now it's just been run down by criminals and pirates, and it's not what it once was. Sort of a civilization in decay, if you will. And it's really the main reason why the sequence was held off for as long as it was. Because I'm not that great of a set designer, so I'd have to call other people in to design my sets for me. There was a day where I called over my friends, Braden, Holden, and I think actually Adam might have been there, and we just designed all these buildings for Blackwater. And Braden especially, he's really good at set building. Like, he'd design these buildings that were just kind of in decay, and there was a bunch of seaweed on them, and it was really cool. Now for these brown base plates here, these were very tricky to get down. What I did at first was I got a green base plate, and I assembled every brown piece I could, and I laid it down on this green base plate. And that worked for a while, but when I actually got time to filming the battle sequence in Blackwater, I just had to kind of bite the bullet and go on eBay and buy a completely brown base plate. I was surprised to find out that those actually existed. I didn't think I'd have any luck on that. So those brown base plates, those helped out a lot, especially on the ginormous Blackwater battle set piece. So for the Drunken Pelican here, this was actually designed by Braden and Holden. I called them over for a night, and they spent the night building this thing. Unfortunately, we had to tear down the whole Fort Lake Arado set to get the brown walls, which was a big shame, because that's a really nice set. But sacrifices must be made, I suppose, especially on films like this. What's interesting is that this tavern was actually envisioned with a black floor, similar to the Laughing Coyote from The Legend. But Braden actually convinced me otherwise, because he said the tan floor would complement the brown walls more, rather than a black one. And he also brought up the really great point that the black floor would kind of conflict with the lighting. And he convinced me. I implemented the tan floor, and I think it was much more aesthetically pleasing to look at than the Laughing Coyote was in The Legend. I suppose you should probably talk about Kay Davis's Hamish here for a little bit. So Kay Davis, the creator of all this, essentially plays Hamish. He was originally supposed to just have a small cameo, but after Jacob filled in the Redbeard role, I didn't have anyone to play Hamish. Jacob was actually supposed to play Hamish for a very long time. In fact, he had already recorded all of his dialogue for him. Yeah, that's something that's pretty unique about this film compared to my other productions, is that there were a lot of recasts. I'll talk about those later. Let me get back to Cade here. So as I was saying, there was no one to play Hamish, and I tried to contact a few people to see if they were interested, but it's kind of hard because no one can do a very convincing Scottish or Irish accent without sounding really cheesy. Cade was cast through a very unique set of circumstances, I must say. We were playing Minecraft one night. Yeah, I know, very mature for some 20-year-olds, but whatever. And we were trying to move some cows or some shit, I don't remember exactly what it was, and Cade just started yelling in a Scottish accent, just kind of joking around, and then I said, "Wait a minute, do that again." And he actually sounded pretty decent, actually. So I had him record his lines that very night, and he got them all done. It was especially impressive for him, because he's not an actor at all. I think this was his first real voice acting role, besides the cameo he had in The Legend. Because of Cade's performance, Hamish became a much more comedic character than what he was really intended to be. But I think it's a welcome change. It's kind of funny to see him swear in a Scottish accent. Recording lines with him was a very interesting experience. We got most of the lines done that night, but there were a few redos that I needed later on, and it got really bizarre, I should say. He wasn't taking it seriously at all, and he ended up giving a long lecture on the geopolitical history of the 100 Years' War. I didn't ask for that, but he just did it anyway. Despite him being sometimes difficult to work with, he always got in his lines, and I definitely laughed the most while recording lines with him. Oh, we're already on to the shard scene, my god. I was talking so much about Kate there that I forgot about Oscar. Wellingham here is played by Oscar Johnson. He's a very talented animator and voice actor. I actually first met him when I was rendering my final cut for The Legend. I discovered his channel, and I was watching one of his movies called The Legacy of Hope, I want to say it was. And I left a comment saying, like, good job, stuff like that, and he clicked on my channel, and he was very impressed with my work. I gotta say, that's the first time that's ever happened. And I went through some of his videos, and I realized just how talented of an actor he was. So I made sure to snatch him for my Olusty video, and he did a pretty good job on that. I told him of my quote-unquote pirate project. It didn't have a title around the time, and he was all on board, pun intended. Oscar has a insane talent for dialogue. If you go through his videos, all of his lines are very well written. So I asked him if he could go through the script a little bit and suggest any dialogue changes, and he did that for the first scene, but he didn't have time to do it for the rest of the script. That's why he's credited for additional dialogue rather than actually having a writing credit. His most notable contribution to the script was Stafford's speech at the beginning where he says, "People of Baird, make no mistake," and it originally went on for a very long time, but he managed to trim it down to just the bare essentials. He seems like a very talented writer, and I'd love to collaborate with him in the future. Anyway, back to the voice acting aspect of him. He was originally up for the part of Gabriel. I believe I already mentioned that previously, so I won't go too in-depth here, but he just sounded a bit too old. That gruff voice was much better suited for Willingham. I actually think Jacob might have tried out for Willingham at one point, but I could be mistaken. But yeah, Oscar was another welcome addition to the cast, and I was blessed to have him. I think that Oscar and Eli are the only voice actors I've worked with that actually scream into their mics. They just give it their all when they voice act. Not to say that everyone else doesn't, but they really go that extra mile when they have to scream. They really scream. Oscar might have Eli beat when it comes to screaming, because he got pretty loud. It got to the point where when he would yell in his lines, it actually hurt to listen to him because he was so loud. There was a lot of his lines where I had to decrease the volume on it because it just got to be too loud. Usually I'll have the opposite problem where I have to increase the volume to make sure they're heard, but there was no problem with Oscar. He was always heard. Let me talk about the shard here really quick before we move on. This was an aspect of the script that Eli absolutely hated. He thought it was way too contrived that a guy from a ship would shipwreck onto the island, steal the shard, and then shipwreck onto Blackwater, and Willingham would get the shard. And he is right, it's very far-fetched, but I needed that link for Stafford to really take the pirates seriously. Because if the pirates only steal Stafford's map, like Eli suggested I do, it really deflates attention because Stafford already knows the coordinates, so what's the point? So it was a tough call, but I had to make it, and I had to do it for the story. The VFX for the shard was actually very difficult, surprisingly. It was Elliot's suggestion to add a glow to it because it wasn't really standing out in the rough cut. So I let him do it, and he added a very nice glow effect to the shard, but the problem was the files got so damn big. A scene including the shard could get up to sometimes 15 gigabytes, which is just insane. You know, you'd think the files that include the Kraken shots at the end would be the biggest files in the movie, but no, it's a shard. It was an effect that I got a little impatient with because it was taking a very long time to do. So there were some shots that I just said, screw it, I'm not adding a glow effect to it. I tried to justify it by saying it glows when it's closer to the locker or some shit, but it didn't really make sense because why would it glow at Blackwater, you know? Yeah, I don't know, that was a bad call. Maybe there'll be a special edition one day where I can go in like George Lucas and change a few effects. I'm sure Elliot would kill me though if I tried to do that. Here's Nick Baca as Captain Graves. Like Tim, I also met him through my high school's theater. I actually knew Nick before Tim because we did a play together, the Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. I know that's a mouthful of a title. When it came to be time to do Clue as our winter play, he was actually my understudy for Colonel Mustard. And so we developed a friendship there where I'd have to share blocking notes of him and so forth. There were actually a few rehearsals he had to fill in for me because I was very sick during that first part of 2020. Something that was very interesting that my director did was that she had all the understudies perform the entire show while the main cast would kind of sit down in the audience and watch the understudies perform. It was really cool seeing a different approach to your performance, and so I actually learned quite a bit from watching Nick on stage. So we developed a friendship behind the scenes, and I eventually asked him to voice in the Pirates film. It still didn't have a title yet around this time, and so he was all for that. He went the extra mile and actually researched how to do a Spanish accent, which was just insane. I was just going to have him kind of half-ass it, but he was really insistent that he'd learn it. It's not perfect, of course, but has there really ever been an American actor that can authentically recreate an accent? I mean, you take the actors from the UK and they can do all sorts of different voices and accents, but the American actors, they can't really do any accent that well. You know, Dick Van Dyke from Mary Poppins kind of comes to mind there. I don't know, it's just something I've kind of noticed that every actor from the UK is just perfect at doing accents while the American ones kind of struggle. Maybe it's because we just kind of have a plain voice and it's really easy to mimic. Sorry for that very weird tangent there. I'll get back to Nick. To my knowledge, this was Nick's first voice acting role, and he does a very good job. It's really interesting to see him hold his own against Eli and Jack later on in the movie. He definitely has a presence in every scene he's in. Ah shit, we're in the middle of this battle here. I should probably talk about that. I'll get back to the Spanish privateers later on. I'll probably bring them back up when Graves turns Redbeard into Stafford later on. But anyway, here's the Battle of Blackwater. This was just a nightmare to shoot. It was really difficult to shoot a battle scene like this without getting repetitive, because there's really only so much one can do before two sides taking turns shooting at one another becomes boring. I mean, it wasn't boring for the actual guys on the ground. I'm sure that would have been very terrifying, but in terms of cinematography and editing, it becomes pretty repetitive. So what I'll oftentimes do is I'll have them just kind of charge into one another. It's very inaccurate at the time, and really wouldn't have been done unless under extreme circumstances, like if they were going to lose a battle. But it's a movie with giant CGI Krakens and Islanders, so who cares? It's already not the most authentic movie. Something that Eli suggested I do was have the locals fire on both sides. Because if you think about it, they're criminals, they don't care which side wins, they're just gonna shoot whoever's in their way. But I thought that would be a bit too confusing for the audience, so I just never filmed that. Something I do kind of regret is not changing the hats of the French, because when they're fighting this up close, it's kind of hard to tell who's who. I mean, the British do have red and the French have blue, but even at that close range, it's very hard to tell which side is which. I should have given the French those tricorn hats, but whatever, too late I suppose. Here's the duel scene between Gabriel and Stafford. This sequence was actually filmed pretty early on, I want to say January 2021. And fun fact, this was actually the first sequence that Elliot did VFX work on. This was a scene that was not in earlier drafts, but I felt was important to have in this final script here. Because originally Gabriel wasn't supposed to meet Stafford in person until that final battle, and that was kind of a bit anticlimactic because there was really no tension or conflict there. And you can't have your main character meet the villain until the end of the movie, so it was appropriate to place this here. A fun fact here about this scene is that this was the first time I really animated sword fighting. Well, technically it wasn't the first scene, but I'll get to that later, but this was the really first big sequence that I animated, in terms of sword fighting at least. This was an aspect that I was really nervous about, because how do you portray a certain character's fighting style versus another character's fighting style? I did a few tests and they didn't really quite work. The problem is those blades are just so damn tiny. I mean, compared to the other LEGO swords, such as the medieval ones and the samurai ones, the pirate ones are very small, so there's not a lot of movement you can really get out of them. So unfortunately, there was only a couple of really specific motions you could make those swords do. If you have a good eye, you'll notice the same repeated movements throughout the movie, like Stafford will go for the defense, and then Gabriel will whack the blade with the offense, and you'll see that repeated through several characters. What I did here for this specific sequence was I actually had the clip from The Force Awakens where Kylo Ren fights Finn on in the background, because I wanted to kind of copy the same movements from that sequence. Because in a way, these scenes are pretty similar. Because you have one character that's an expert swordsman, and then you have another character that's not very experienced but is full of rage. And so I try to kind of match the same movements of that sequence. I think there's a few beats that Kylo does in here that I copied for Stafford. Because in this sequence, Stafford is not unleashing his full potential. He's just clearly toying with Gabriel. He's kind of curious to see how he thinks he's going to take him down. And in contrast, Gabriel's just unleashing everything he has. He's going full rage mode on Stafford. Speaking of Gabriel, in this sequence here, he was actually supposed to lose an eye originally. It was written like that in the script, but it was never actually filmed. There were a couple of reasons why it didn't happen that way. One was the design of the character. When I write scripts, I don't really have a certain design for characters in mind. The designs will typically come later. There are exceptions to this rule, of course, such as Redbeard, because he's the official minifigure that LEGO put out, but other than that, I usually custom design my characters. Part of the reason we ended up ditching the eye thing was because of the face we used for Gabriel. We used the vintage LEGO Obi-Wan Kenobi head from Phantom Menace. And it would look really weird if we had to draw a fake eye patch on there after he'd lost the eye, and it would not really fit well with the whole vintage aesthetic we were trying to do. Another reason we ended up ditching it was because of Elliot. We didn't want to have a sequence where he was bleeding out through his eye, and we thought that would be a bit too distracting, and plus it would mean a lot of work for Elliot, so we just thought it was better if he was sliced from the side or something. I know we already kind of passed this moment, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. The part where Redbeard reveals the shard to Stafford was something that Eli absolutely hated. He said that's the dumbest thing that Redbeard could possibly do, but I still needed that moment because how does Stafford realize the pirates are going to the same thing, you know? And what better way to add urgency if now they have the shard and the map. Okay, now I'll get back to what's actually happening on the screen here, instead of talking about sequences that have already passed. This Escape from Blackwater sequence was originally a lot shorter, but I beefed it up a bit in reshoots because I felt they got away a bit too easy. I added a bit of conflict with a couple of ships in the harbor and how they'd narrowly avoid them. And it added a bit more of an explanation as to why they couldn't get to the Barracuda in time. Because originally they just kind of drifted out to sea and they said, we can't get to the Barracuda, and I felt that was a bit too out of character in a sense, because these guys, I feel like they would paddle if they had to get to the Barracuda, but if there were a couple of ships that were stopping them, that would make a bit more sense. No matter what you do, this is always going to be a tricky moment, because you need to separate Redbeard from the main crew for a while, but you have to find a way that's not contrived to do it. So I thought that extending this particular sequence would serve a better function for the story. I remember this raft here was a bit of a challenge to make. When I first wrote the screenplay, I always envisioned them being on the LEGO raft that the Pirates line put out back in the early 90s. But when I actually looked on eBay for that, that was way too small. And there was no way I was going to fit 5 characters on that tiny little raft. So I just figured I'd build my own. I just took a lot of brown tile pieces and I put the mast from the Lake Town set on there. And I made a little raft. The raft became a challenge later on, because despite what you might think, these scenes with the raft were not actually filmed first. The scene where they're chased by Captain Graves, that was actually filmed first with the raft. And so, in that scene, the raft gets destroyed. And so I don't know why I did this, but I actually destroyed the raft for real in that scene. And I didn't realize that, oh shit, I need to actually film the first scene of them on the raft. And so I had to study that scene very carefully to see how I actually built that damn thing, and I had to reassemble it. It was not fun. But thankfully it all worked out in the end, and you can see this on your screen right now. This overhead shot here was originally actually meant to be a very long panning shot. It was actually meant to pay homage to that one scene in The Longest Day where there's that long take of the soldiers in the harbor and the camera kind of pans over. It was meant to kind of be the same spirit of that, but practicality kind of came into play there, and it just wasn't going to be possible. So I had to settle for an overhead shot on a much smaller scale than what was originally intended. This tiny little scene of Captain Javier and Louis, as he's called in the script, was actually something that I almost cut out of the film. I thought the edit would work a lot smoother if it cut from Captain Graves right to the raft, but then I figured we don't see the French for a very long time after this, so it'd be beneficial to know what they're up to and what their plans are, and I figured it was a short, like 13-second scene, so I put it back into the cut. This whole raft sequence here was filmed very early on. I want to say June 2020, so that's towards the beginning of the shoot there. Overall, there was not a whole lot that was changed about this particular sequence. There were a few beats of dialogue that were kind of shuffled around a bit, but other than that, this sequence relatively remained intact from the shooting script. Writing scenes like this is always very tricky, because there's all this exposition you have to get out, but at the same time you don't want to bore your audience. So what I did here was I wrote it in the style of an argument. Instead of just discussing what they're going to do, each character has their own certain objective they want to get. Gabriel wants to continue the mission, Benjamin wants to go back, and Christopher kind of supports Gabriel, so each character has something to contribute during this scene. Except for Mr. Stone, of course, he's just kind of chilling in the background. I'm just chilling in Cedar Rapids. Actually, the reason he does that is because there was a very long and extensive sequence that was cut out of the film here. It was a scene that involved a group of sharks attacking the raft. And the reason they did this was because it was revealed the shark attracted all sorts of sea life to the raft. It was written in the script, and it was filmed and edited together, and actually all the VFX were done for it. And it was in every cut of the film up until those last couple weeks of post-production. We realized that it really kind of stopped the story. At the end of the day, how was having this elaborate 2-minute action sequence getting us closer to the island? Because of this scene, the narrative just kind of came to a standstill, and then ultimately wasn't necessary to include in the film. I suppose this is this film's version of the Lost Spider Pit sequence from King Kong. But unlike the Spider Pit sequence, this scene is not lost. In fact, it's still on my hard drive. I'll probably release it when it comes to getting around to the deleted scene video. These shots of the Blackwater Harbor being covered with wood and debris was added in reshoots, because it cleared up a plot hole of why Stafford sent Graves after the pirates, instead of him going after the pirates himself. So with this change, it's implied that Stafford's vessels are all trapped in this debris, and Captain Graves is the only really vessel in the harbor that can get out. So that's part of the reason why Stafford chose Graves to go after these pirates. Speaking of Graves, let's talk about him for a bit. Captain Graves and his crew were very close to getting the axe. They were a later addition in the scripts. They only appeared in the third draft now that I think about it. And they were there from then on, but they were almost cut out. I thought it would be complicating things a bit by adding another faction into the whole mix and adding another bad guy when the British were already kind of well defined. But ultimately they ended up staying in the film because I needed a exciting way to close Act 1. And so Graves and his crew stayed. That meant spending more money on getting more vintage Legos. That Imperial Armada ship, that was a lot of money, but I ended up getting it anyway. The Spanish in this film are kind of a bit goofy, mainly due to the outfits they're wearing. During the 1700s, they would not be wearing this conquistador armor anymore. That was an outfit which, even by that time, was considered outdated. It wouldn't have been worn for at least 200 years. It would kind of be the equivalent of a American in 2022 going to a bar dressed in clothes from the Wild West. So it is kind of a bit goofy, but I wanted the Spanish to kind of have their own identity compared to the British and French. It kind of reminds me what Braveheart did by having the Scottish and the blue face painting kilts, even though those wouldn't have been worn until like 300 years later, I believe. But it helps them kind of stand out more. And plus, including Captain Graves gives Captain Redbeard kind of a rivalry, in a sense. Sort of similar to kind of Rooster Cogburn and Ned Pepper in True Grit, which was the inspiration for this relationship between these two characters. So ultimately, I think it was a good choice to leave Captain Graves in the script. This sequence here of the whole turning in Redbeard was something that went on way too long, admittedly. I tried to cut it down in editing, but it just didn't work. There was too much information that we were missing. There were a few lines of dialogue from Stafford that were cut out, but other than that, this scene, had kind of a brain fart there. Anyway, the scene remained relatively intact from what it was in the script. This sequence here is not something I'm particularly proud of, because I think it kind of goes on a bit too long. The audience is already worn out when Graves leaves, and they're even more tired when Governor Lee arrives in the scene. It just feels kind of dragged out. I'm sure I could have rewritten it somehow to make it shorter. I don't know. When you make a film, there's always all these regrets you have. Even if you think your film's good, you always want to go back and change something. I guess it's up to the audience to decide whether or not they like this particular sequence. And now that I think about it, Governor Lee kind of comes out of nowhere, doesn't he? How could Broadside send a request that quick and Governor Lee comes across the English Channel to get to Blackwater? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I suppose, but Then again, what does in this movie? I guess the one positive aspect about this scene is that it kind of begins to show Stafford's descent into madness. Because now there's this superior force that's overseeing his own expedition, and that kind of drives him off the deep end. And later on, when he kills Governor Lee, that's sort of the complete descent into chaos. It's interesting because Governor Lee is one of the few characters who can see right through Stafford and knows who he really is. So he, in a sense, knows what makes him tick and knows how to keep him on a short leash, if you will. In a way, he's almost like Stafford's surrogate father, almost. He's known Stafford since boyhood, and he knows who he is, and is one of the few that truly realizes the monster that's buried within Stafford. Because really, Stafford's this pathetic and confused man who just happens to hold all this power. And Lee kind of taunts him because he knew Stafford's father and he knew the man that he was. It's really intriguing to watch how both of these voice actors play on that concept. Eli really plays the scene well, kind of showing the beginning of descent into madness, if you will. And Jack always kind of just taunts and criticizes Stafford, so it's really great to see these two opposing forces meet each other. Because these are two characters that are really never meant to be in the same room together, because they're just too much at opposite ends. And both of these men understand that. But in a way, Lee feels it's his responsibility to kind of make sure that Stafford doesn't go unchecked. And so he does it out of spite, really, to hold up Redbeard here, just to delay the expedition. He just thinks this is all a fool's errand, and he's really only here because of Stafford. Moving on from that particular sequence, here's the Captain Graves raft chase scene. This scene was also filmed very early on, and looking back, I'm not very proud of how it looks. You can tell that I'm still using that one lamp, and the lighting looks pretty shitty here. I'm still kind of figuring out how to move ships in water and all that, so the animation's not the best here either. I'd wager this is probably the worst looking scene in the film besides the Barrett opening. This is definitely the one sequence I wish I could go back and refilm, because I'm just not too proud of how this looks. Anyway, lighting aside, this whole ambush scene was actually Eli's idea. As I wrote in the script, there were no obstacles getting to the island, they just sort of landed on the shores there. But I felt that was a bit too easy, and felt honestly anticlimactic, because they spent the whole the whole movie trying to get to this island, and it was just way too easy to get there, and you're like, really? That was it? So Eli wrote this fun little chase scene of Captain Graves ambushing them before they land on the island. It brings up a plot hole, of course, because Graves must have the fastest fucking ship in the whole world if he's able to get Blackwater to the island in that short amount of time, but whatever, it's a movie. It was definitely a good idea on Eli's part, because it kind of gave more of a sense of urgency in the film at this point, because we're reminded that our main characters here are still being hunted down, and so it was good to have the sequence in here. And plus it gave more use of that Imperial Armada set from the 1996 LEGO Pirates line. It was also another great opportunity to add a bit more comedy with Mr. Stone. Now, like I said, in movies that are as big as this, I like the concept of kind of the everyday sort of guy, like going along with the heroes and just trying to fit in. And Mr. Stone was kind of a great opportunity to do that, because he's sort of the character that the audience can relate to the most, because he's the one that doesn't really have any experience in terms of adventure or sword fighting, so he's kind of along for the ride here in a sense. And those are always my favorite characters in movies, the ones that are just kind of trying to survive, So during some of these action sequences here, I made sure that Mr. Stone was involved, and he doesn't really know what to do, and I think it's pretty realistic that people wouldn't know what to do in those situations. So Mr. Stone is sort of the character that the audience really relates to. You just gotta be careful to make sure that those characters aren't involved too much, What I try to do is I try to space out Mr. Stone's scenes a little bit so he's not too overbearing. Because if he's in every scene, it's just gonna get really annoying, so it's best if he's in one scene, he disappears for a while, and then he comes back, when you least expect him to. So I made sure that he had an impact on the story, but not so much where you're just dreading his scenes whenever he comes on screen. I don't know. I think I did a pretty decent job of spacing him out, but who knows. Maybe some people will think he's in the movie too much, and some people will say he's not in the movie enough. So you can't please everyone, I suppose. We'll talk more about him in a bit, but I want to get back to some of the Islander stuff here. Now, Eli actually wrote a version of this scene where they land on the shore, and they would disappear one by one, and they'd say, where's Christopher, or where's Hamish, and it would kind of be like that one chapter in The Hobbit where they're captured by the trolls one by one, and it would kind of be similar to Return of the Jedi, where they're in that Ewok net thing, and it would kind of be that's how they meet the Islanders. But I just kind of felt that was a bit too complex. I thought it was much easier for them to run into Sin-K here instead of that whole elaborate setup there. I just wanted to get to the Islanders quicker, and that whole sequence would just delay us from that even longer. Even in the final cut here, I still think we're introduced to the island and the Islanders way too late. It's about 90 minutes before we meet our first Islander, and these are characters that the audience is supposed to grow attached to. And it's kind of hard to grow attached to this culture here when you're introduced to them so late in the movie. But they are still given some time to have emotional scenes, so it's fine, I suppose. Casting for the Islanders here was probably the most difficult casting choices in the entire production process. When I wrote the script, I kind of envisioned them having a sub-Saharan African accent, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense based on the geography, and the Islanders are clearly more reminiscent of a Polynesian culture than anything in Africa. So the concept was abandoned pretty early on because it would be extremely difficult to track down voice actors that could do that dialect there. So that was unfortunately a concept we had to kind of cast aside. So then we discussed among ourselves who would be best to fill in these parts. Because we knew that we wanted a wiser, older sounding voice for Kahuka, but we weren't quite sure what to do with Sin-K here. As I previously mentioned, Matt actually auditioned for Sin-K at one point, but it was decided that he'd be much better for Gabriel. So I reached out to Christopher Zeman, who previously voiced some minor roles in The Legend. And admittedly, he's the only casting choice that I slightly regret. Christopher is a wonderful actor, but I don't think he was quite right for this part. He just kind of sounds too proper, in a sense. He doesn't sound like he's lived on this island for years at all. He just kind of sounds like he's an actor playing a part. But people seem to like him just fine, so I suppose it's not a terrible choice. Now, a concept we briefly toyed with was the idea that the Islanders would know every language in existence. There's a line that makes it into the final film. I think it's in the campfire scene later on where Hans mentions the Islanders know every language in the world, and that would be explained because they'd have all this wisdom from the Shard, and Sin-K would kind of basically do a little trolling here, and he'd speak in all these different languages here, and they'd try to decipher what he was saying, and then he'd finally say, "I speak English just fine." It led to some funny lines of Stone because he'd think that Sin-K was speaking Italian for some reason. I don't know. It was just another one of those concepts that wasn't really necessary. It was good at world building, but not for advancing the story. What I wanted to do was do something different with the whole native trope. Because pretty much in every movie when they encounter a native tribe, they're always backwards and they're so uncivilized. But what I wanted to do here was kind of spin that concept on its head. I wanted to show that these islanders were very advanced and they were pretty much almost power themselves. And a couple ways I wanted to demonstrate that was that there's a concept where the Shard would give them all the information of the outside world and they'd be up to all the current events. Basically almost like a television in a sense. And that's how they'd outsmart all of these foreigners that came to the island, because the Spanish or French or whoever the fuck lands on their island, they'd think they're just a backwards tribe, but then they'd pull off their mask in a sense, and then they'd kill them all. They were able to play on the expectations of the white European, which is why no one has really conquered their island yet. And this approach very nearly works at the battle scene later on, because they almost win against Stafford, but Gabriel has to break the formation and charge, and then Stafford brings out the artillery, and then it's all over. I think they probably would have won if they had just retreated into the jungle and waited the artillery out, but Gabriel broke formation. Oh shit, we're already on to the execution scene. I'll come back to the Islander stuff here in a bit. Let's talk about the execution here. I was on such a tangent that I wasn't paying attention. Originally, as it was scripted, this came immediately after the scene where Stafford and Governor Lee are talking, and would cut to his execution. But I thought that scene was going on a bit too long, and we needed to get to the island quicker, so it was moved later on. A lot of people like this scene, and some even say it's their favorite in the movie, but this is a scene that I admittedly don't like. I mean, it's fine, I guess, but it just kind of distracts from what's going on the island, because we're so wrapped up in that, and then we have to cut back to Redbeard, and we really don't care. I just think it kind of takes a bit too long is all, but It's a 3-hour movie, who cares? That line where Giles turns to Governor Lee and he says he wishes to be let go was inspired by that scene where Brendan Fraser hangs in The Mummy. I thought that line from Giles would get a much bigger laugh, but you can't land with every joke, I suppose. This whole sequence here, Redbeard escaping from the Hangman's platform, was inspired by a scene in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is easily the worst Narnia movie. But I do like the scene in the Lone Islands where they're at a slave auction, and then Reaper Chief rallies the crew and they rescue Lucy and the others. I thought that scene was really creative in a otherwise very uncreative movie, so I wanted to kind of pay tribute to that here. So I thought it'd be fun if the pirates disguised themselves and they infiltrated the execution. I thought it'd be a neat little scene to include. Now, admittedly, the lighting here is very hit or miss. I don't know why I did this, but I filmed this over the course of 3 days that were not back to back, and I would come back to the sequence irregularly because I was filming other stuff. And would lead to some glaring continuity errors, because when the lighting's good in the sequence, that's on a different day, and when it's really shitty, it's on another day. And it wasn't back-to-back days, so I didn't really know where I left off, so it was kind of edited from nothing, essentially. The VFX here are also kind of underwhelming here. Elliot was busy doing some other sequences, and so one of the backup artists had to fill in here, and it's fine on its own, but it doesn't really match with the rest of the standard that was set by Elliot in this film. Now, the scene here between Governor Lee and Stafford was something that I really should have cut out. It's pretty redundant here, and all the information that we need has already been given to us, so we don't really need to see the sequence here. It's just kind of more back and forth between Governor Lee and Stafford, which we've already seen. So it's just essentially stalling the picture. God, I'm a boomer. I just called this movie a moving picture. Can we go back to calling movies pictures? I think that's a lot cooler than saying I went to a movie. I went to a moving picture. This is the point, kids, where you turn off the commentary, because I'm just talking crazy here. I suppose this scene isn't entirely useless, because it further emphasizes Stafford's descent into complete madness, because he's essentially taking all the British Army with him, which is very overkill, especially since he's a naval admiral and not in charge of the army at all. So it kind of sets up his want for more power, in a way. Well, and also, before the sequence ends here, I want to clear up something that people were confused about. During the second act, people questioned where'd all these pirates come from? Well, what was scripted was that the citizens of Blackwater would hop aboard the Barracuda, kind of similar to what happened at Whale Hunt Harbor, but I'm not sure that really came across. There's a brief shot of them extending the deck down, but that could easily be argued that's just for Redbeard's crew. And so you have to question how did it go from 30 to like 90 soldiers later on, or not soldiers, pirates. God, my brain's fried. But anyway, yeah, I hope that clears up the plot hole there. And here we are back on the island, so I can get back to talking about the Islanders again. This whole set piece here of the village was the largest set I ever worked with in a Lego production. Not including the main portion, there were 6 base plates around it. I wanted the village to feel like it had been lived in and people could actually exist in there. And so what I did was I had Braden and Holden build a couple of huts for the village. They were only supposed to do like 1 or 2, but they ended up doing, I think it was 6 or 7, and all of those make it into the final film. Braden especially went above and beyond. When he was building the huts, he'd include stuff inside there, like he'd include little tables and even included some shelves in there that they store food in. And I asked him, why are you doing that? No one's ever going to see this. And he said, it just makes it feel more real. You never see it in the film, but a lot of those huts have stuff inside of it just because Braden thought it would look nicer to have. So I got especially lucky having those two help me build sets for this production. All of the stuff on the island, minus the battle sequence, was filmed very early on. I want to say August 2020, and you can kind of tell because some of the lighting is very iffy. I remember it was especially difficult during that initial establishing shot where you're first revealed to the village. I remember it was very difficult because the background, the blue sheet, kept on falling over, so I'd have to redo that shot a couple of times. And it's a very complex shot, so redoing it's no picnic because you got all these moving parts to it. You have a boat going around the river, you have people walking around and just kind of living their lives, so it's not something you want to spend too much time on. but we ended up doing 5 or 6 takes of it, I want to say. So it was definitely a real time-consuming shot to do. And it was kind of a wake-up call that this film was not going to be as easy as I thought it was going to be. Because during those first initial months shooting, I thought this would be out by 4th of July time easy. Because I figured the reason The Legend took so long was because I didn't really have anyone cast yet until that final year of production. And so I thought, everyone's cast now, so this shouldn't take that long at all to do. And I was very wrong. But I suppose this production wasn't as frustrating as The Legend was, because stuff was actually getting done most of the time. Even though it still took a while, we were always productive and we always moved closer towards getting the film done. And all things considered, I think this actually took a shorter amount of time than The Legend did. The Legend took like 2 years and like 4 or 5 months or something, while this film didn't even reach 2 years. It reached like 1 year and like 9 months or something. So definitely much more smoother than any of my other productions. King Kahuka here is actually pretty interesting because he was recast actually. Initially I had a person by the name of Gavin Rutzel in the role of Kahuka, and he actually recorded all of his lines, but I just didn't feel like it was working. I said, maybe this could still work if I had him do a couple of redos. And so we did a couple of redos and it just still didn't sound right. He sounded way too young and he sounded really cheesy, quite frankly. So it was a painful decision, but we ended up having to recast him. It especially hurt because he was very ecstatic about the whole project. And so we searched for a few more people that could possibly play Kahuka, and we eventually landed on Energetic Lego Films, or Dre Underwood as he likes to call himself. What's interesting about him is that I was actually already familiar with his work. When I was 14, there was a stop motion that was released called the Battle of the Five Armies that Louis K. Wood produced, and it was essentially just a recreation of the third Hobbit movie, and he voiced Thorin Oakenshield in that, and he was pretty good in that role. And so it was really surreal working with someone that I not grew up, but was in a stop motion that inspired me to kind of work on longer projects. And he was very professional whenever I worked with him, and he was a very experienced actor. I didn't have to do much direction with him at all. All the lines came naturally to him, which is an especially necessary talent to have when you're delivering scenes like this, which have so much heavy exposition in them. He delivers all of his lines in such a captivating way that it's just impossible not to listen to him. So I think we hit the bullseye in a sense when casting Kahuka. He has such an air of wisdom and age to his voice that I really wanted for this character. So I think we made the right choice when doing that recast there. Scenes like this where there's just a spew of exposition coming out is really difficult to deliver for any actor, so you really have to have a good one when you're wanting to convey information that the audience will be able to retain. Writing the scene here went through a couple different variations. In the first couple of drafts, it would play more heavily into the Greek mythology aspect, and that would sort of tie into the Spartan warriors reincarnated idea that I was trying to convey. And so Kahuka would explain that Poseidon himself actually created this island, and there'd be a race of a bunch of krakens that inhabited it. And the islanders would basically hunt these krakens to extinction, but then there'd be one that would remain. And so that's the kraken that is used in our story. That was a pretty out there idea, and so we changed it to where there'd only be just one kraken, and that's what made it so special. But we still kind of left hints of there being a sort of prior, grander civilization, and the remains of that were slowly sinking into the sea. And the locker at one point would have been this Atlantean sort of grand civilization that was lost to time. But like so many other things with the Islanders, it just wasn't necessary to keep, and so we just simplified it to the bare basics. This was a scene that Eli especially felt was important because everything was going to be explained here. We had built up a sort of mystery of what the shard is and what exactly its origins are, and so everything had to be kind of explained here. So we went through it a few times to make sure that there was nothing left out and that everyone understood what was at stake. And that's the reason why I placed so much emphasis on the importance of this map here. I wanted to make sure the audience understood the geography of the island and why they were fighting where they were next to a river to kind of block the British from entering the island. Speaking of that map, that was insanely difficult to get down right. I wanted this sort of a Tolkien-style map for that shot, but I wasn't sure where I was going to get that from. So I was in talks with Braden, since he actually is a very talented artist, if he'd want to do that for me, and he said sure, but when I'd asked him to do it, he just said, I'll get around to it. And it eventually got to be so late in production that I just said, screw it, I'll ask someone else. And it was actually Elliot who ended up doing it for me. I drew a very rough sketch of what I wanted the island to look like, and then he kind of transferred that to a 1700 style map of the island. And it looks pretty great on screen. I mean, I'm not sure how great that hand animation I did looked, but I think the map looks fantastic. A little fun fact about the map there is that if you have a very good eye, you'll notice that it's actually the same shape as the island was in the 1933 King Kong movie. When I drew the rough sketch for it, I wanted to make sure it looked exactly like Skull Island did in that movie. And luckily there's a scene where Denham and Inglehorn, they show the map, and so I freeze-framed that part of the movie, and I just basically sketched that. The idea of the map thing was inspired by a scene in The Two Towers where Faramir and another ranger, they're basically pointing to all the stuff in Middle-earth, and it helped give a sense of geography for the audience, and so I felt that was important here to do as well. There's a reaction shot of Hans in there that was actually the last shot I ever filmed for the movie. When I was editing together the film, there were a few shots I realized that I still needed, and so I had to go back and do 3 or 4 pickup shots. I think that's what the number came down to. And this was the last one I did. I think I did this one in January of 2022, so this year, yeah. It's pretty crazy how close to the wire that stuff can come down to. That scene we just passed of Redbeard on the Barracuda there was something that I really wanted to cut out. In fact, it was very close to just getting the axe in the movie, but I felt that the transition would have been a bit rough if we just cut from Kahuka right to the slopes of the island, so unfortunately it had to stay in the movie. This was a scene I never liked, even in the script. But it's one of those things that you have to do, or else it just kind of becomes jarring if you cut right to the throne room to an emotional scene like this. And you're also staying in one setting for too long, so you just kind of had to be there to pass time. This scene right here of Gabriel and Christopher on the slopes of the island was always a scene that I really liked. It's a point where the audience can kind of just take a breather and just kind of sit back for a while. Because up to this point, they've been bombarded with all this action and all this exposition, so it's really a nice moment for the audience to just kind of breathe a bit. And it also gives us a better insight into who these characters are and what their goals are. You finally begin to understand who Gabriel is and how he sort of has this all buried within him. Beneath that cynical, sarcastic guy, he truly cares about this mission because of what happened to him, and he doesn't want other people to go through that. It gives a lot more needed depth to Gabriel. In the quest to avenge his family, he finds a new one in the form of Redbeard and the pirates. Wow, guys, that's the theme of the film. Oh my God, he said it. He said the theme of the film. Jesus, if you're still listening to this, I applaud you. The sunset monologue here was something that was pretty tricky to write. I wrote a initial version of it, but it was incredibly cheesy. And so Eli came in and he sort of got the gist of it, and he's fixed up the dialogue a bit, and it's basically what's on screen now. Some people might think it's cheesy, but I really like the polished up monologue that Eli wrote here. In many ways, it sort of mirrors the campfire scene from The Legend, but it's much shorter than that. Matt really carries this scene. I mean, without him, I don't think this monologue would have worked as well. You can just feel the pain and the buried sorrow he has in his voice performance there. It's almost like it physically hurts him to say this, and it's not something that's easy for him to get out. It's a shame that Matt won't consider a career in acting, because he's very good here. I know that he's expressed to me that he doesn't like his performance in this film, and he feels like he could have done a lot better, but I still think he did a pretty damn good job, but maybe that's just me. This little bit of the Spanish privateer attacking Christopher here was actually the first bit of sword fighting I animated. I know I said that Stafford versus Gabriel was the first major sequence, but this was technically the first I did. And you can sort of figure that out easily, because the animation here with the sword fighting's not really that good. You can see how choppy the animation is with the hits and the blocks, so it's really not that great to look at. And for the two of you who care, this is actually supposed to be the same soldier on the beach that was talking to Captain Graves earlier. I'm not sure if that really came across, but it's supposed to be him. These bits of Gabriel running through the jungle here were something that I filmed pretty late on. The screenplay called for a lot of sword fighting here, because these Spanish privateers were supposed to be like the best swordsmen in Europe, and so I tried to convey that here. And it was kind of hard to really show that through animation. The script mentioned how physically exhausting it was for Gabriel to take down one of them, and how he became pretty beat after just taking down only one of them. But I was just so tired at that point that I really didn't want to animate another major sword fighting sequence, so I just kind of settled for half-assing it. There's a few elements of it that were retained in the final film, like him slicing the armor plate and him chopping off a couple hands, but that's really it. I didn't really feel like animating a whole lot for the sequence. For these arrows here, I remember how worried we were that these weren't going to look good. The script mentioned how skilled of archers the Islanders were, and we were afraid we weren't going to be able to communicate that with the arrows there. I considered doing the practical route where I'd take some red clay to represent blood and I'd kind of shove a stick in their back, but then Elliot said, "Hey, why don't I CGI this?" And I said, I don't know, it might look a bit weird. But then he said, no, I think I can do it. And I said, okay, let's try it. And so he created them all in Blender, and all the arrows in the film are computer generated. And they turned out magnificent. They were better than what I could have hoped for. He was able to mix the practical setting and then the computer imagery into it just brilliantly. I mean, you'll never beat the likes of Kurosawa when you're doing arrows, but I think we did a pretty good job for what we had. This little skirmisher on the beach was something that I cut down a lot. This actually wasn't in the original script. I just thought it would be fun to kind of show the Islanders pursuing the Spanish and kind of driving them off their shore. But it just went on way too long, and it kind of got to the point where it was boring, like, okay, let's wrap this up here. And so I cut a couple shots from it. Looking back, the edits are pretty abrupt, and you can tell when there's a cut, but I think my mind was in the right place. I just didn't execute it very well. Oh boy, that shot of Graves leaving there looks like ass. The ship just speeds out of there, my god. I guess the Spanish really are the fastest privateers in the world. I like this little short exchange here between Willingham and Kahuka, because they just won this victory, or so it seems, but then you only realize this is just the beginning and they'll be back. Kahuka and everyone else involved now kind of realizes that the ball's in motion and there's no way to stop it. That's why Kahuka gives that look back to his marching soldiers there, because he realizes how many of them are going to have to die. And as leader, how do I bring as many soldiers home as possible? That's why it's especially hard when doing Lego films like this, because you can't really convey emotion through a smiling minifigure face. That was also a big problem with the 2019 Lion King remake. They couldn't show emotion through their faces. So that's why so much of it has to rely on the talent of the actor. Because facial expressions are pretty much non-existent, you have to put even more emphasis on the vocal performance. Just one of the many pains of filmmaking, I suppose. Oh, thank God, we're finally at Act 2. I went on a whole spiel of why I like intermissions in the Legend commentary, so if you really want to hear that, you should go to that portion of the commentary, but I retain my same position here. I think it's good to have a break, especially in a longer film like this, because it gives the audience a bit more time to breathe and take in what they just saw. I guess I'm biased since I come from a theater background. I'm always used to doing plays in 2 acts. My drama teacher back in high school would always tell us during the intermissions of our shows that we got them in with a hook with the first act, and we gotta make sure we keep up the same energy with Act 2. Even though you've all had a break, it's important not to lose that momentum. And so that's what I kind of tried to do here. I mean, obviously this is a visual medium rather than a stage play, so there are a few differences there, but overall that same concept I think remains intact. Because the film was already running ridiculously long at that point, I decided not to do a built-in intermission, and rather I just kind of did a 15-second text saying, this is where intermission begins, so this is where you take a break. I think that was a good call, because it didn't stretch out the runtime to something like 3 hours and 30 minutes. That would have been terrible. Despite being the same movie, Act 1 and Act 2 are very different tonally. Act 1 has the job of establishing all these plot threads and characters, and Act 2 doesn't have that responsibility, and so it can go bigger and pretty much have an explosion of energy. Act 2 does a much better job of just getting to the damn point, and not really wasting time. So I suppose it's more fun to watch in that way. This scene right here where Graves and his men come back was actually the first scene that was filmed on my new phone. My old device, which I had filmed all of The Lost World and all the Legend on, and I think half of this film on, was due for a long-needed upgrade, because I'd had that thing for almost 5 years at that point. And so they said, you're getting an upgrade whether you like it or not, and I really didn't want to, because I had all this footage from the Pirates film still on there, and so transferring that was just a bitch, but we finally got that done. And I went to work right away just filming more sequences, and the change in quality is just immediately noticeable. The scenes now had a much more clearer look to them, rather than the grainy sort of stretched out images that I had done in the past. So it was just great filming with this new camera here. Like I previously mentioned, the technical aspect of film is something that I don't really like, which is extremely hypocritical because that's the main fucking point of film. But even then, it was very noticeable that there was a difference in quality. It was just a blast working with this new phone because finally my images looked like how I wanted them to look. So it was great filming with that. This scene here was originally scripted as taking place the next morning, but I thought that'd be kind of weird because the next scene after this is a night scene at a campfire, and so that would mean a day would have passed, and so it would be out of character for the Islanders to kind of wait a whole day to start training, and so I moved the scene to pretty much taking place right after the Spanish have got their asses kicked, essentially. And I think it was a good call because it leads to a very visually unique sequence from the rest of the movie. That yellow background contrasted with the white ship, I think, leads to a very interesting visual, but maybe that's just me. Maybe someone thinks it's the ugly shot of the movie, who knows. I like this little conversation the three of them have here because it kind of further shows Stafford is losing grip on reality, and he's watching his dreams of valor and glory being just taken away from him, and he'll pretty much do anything to make sure that doesn't happen, even if that means murdering a superior officer. All the characters have a clear goal and objective, and it's pretty fun to watch. It's like something that would have been played out on stage almost. All of these voice actors do a very good job of standing out. There's all these shifting power dynamics between them. At first, Eli's the one that's kind of in control, like he's sort of mocking Graves, but then Nick's able to retort back and say, well, if you don't help me, I won't help you. And then finally, Jack kind of puts Eli in his place there. All these three actors have a very distinct voice and personality, and it could have been very easy for any one of them to have their voice kind of lost and be overshadowed by another actor. But that doesn't happen here. Everyone carries the scene, which is especially important in a ensemble film like this. It's very easy for your voice and character to get lost, but everyone still manages to have a firm grip on their characters. And as a result, no one's really shoved into the background. Here we are back on the island here. I should probably talk more about the Islanders and their whole aesthetic. I know that I already kind of talked about them a bit, but there were a few things that I didn't quite get to. For one, their main influence was from the Last Samurai, and how the samurai would kind of be these elite ancient warriors who are stuck in an age of the sword and shield versus the modern age of gunpowder, but they're still able to go toe-to-toe with the modern forces. I just thought that the concept of such a strong and ancient culture being on the path for complete collapse was just fascinating to me, and so I sort of implemented that into the film. And obviously, Katsumoto was a huge inspiration for the King Kahuka character. They both act really similarly. Something that's pretty funny is that I described the village looking like New Zealand. I don't know why I did that. That's something you're not really supposed to do in a script, but I wrote that in there anyway. Just something I thought I would mention before I forgot it. Well, another thing I'd like to briefly talk about before I move on is the shields. A lot of people questioned why the Islanders could just deflect bullets with their shields, and there was originally an explanation for that. It was written that the Islanders were going to have a special mine of iron or something, and they would implement that in their shields, and they would be able to deflect pretty much anything. I think one version of the script had an Islander deflecting a cannonball at one point, and it would tie further into the Spartan warriors reincarnated and how they'd use the shield phalanx formation, but it was just a bit too far-fetched, obviously, and we didn't really need that explanation. I ended up keeping the aspect of the Islanders deflecting the bullets with their shields, because, come on, that's pretty awesome, and I ended up cutting out the explanation for it. Guess at the end of the day, it's just magic from the shard. That's always a trick if you write yourself into a corner, just say it's magic and be done with it. The line here where Mr. Stone kind of barges in and talks about the repeating the filament of oranges, that was actually an improv line by Jaden. Originally, the line was, "Did you know the greatest investment besides your home is actually your home?" That was taken from a old YouTube poop of Billy Mays that I thought was funny. But the line just didn't really work. So I asked Jaden if he could improv a few things, and so he did, and the repeating filament of oranges line I thought was pretty funny, so I kept that instead. I never like doing improv because it's pretty much always garbage. And as a writer, you have that responsibility to actually write the line and not just say improv line here, you know. That was a trap that the 2016 Ghostbusters remake fell into, because they had these four funny actresses, and they just said, be funny. Well, sometimes you can't just be funny, you have to have material to do that. But there are a few select times where improv is appropriate, and so that's what I did here. Yeah, honestly, looking back, I don't really like this campfire sequence much, because it just kind of slows down the movie, and we're not learning anything new, essentially. It really should have been cut out. I don't know why this stayed in the film. But it's here now, so take that as you will. This is a moment here where Redbeard arrives at the island. It was originally a lot longer. It was filmed that the ship would be sailing to the island, and then it would cut inside the Redbeard, and Mr. Adams would yell out, land ho! And then Redbeard would run to the outside of the cabin, and they'd run on deck. But I felt that was just taking a bit too long, and so I cut it down to where you just see him exiting the cabin, and I thought that was a bit better, because now instead of wasting time, we get to the point. I'm going to talk about Mr. Adams here, I think, for a bit. Now, contrary to what people believe, the name Mr. Adams was not actually named after the voice actor Adam Blummer. It was actually based on the 1933 King Kong movie. There was a character in there named Mr. Adams who was the second mate, I believe. Actually, shit, I think his name was Briggs, now that I think about it. But anyway, he was a minor character and he had just 2 lines, and I thought the name Mr. Adams kind of sounded seaworthy, and so I just kind of put that for the character. The reason I did that was because in the script he actually didn't have a name. No one referred to him as Mr. Adams. He was always just labeled as Pirate 1, kind of similar to Union Soldier 9 in The Legend. He doesn't have a name. So the name Mr. Adams is there just because it looks better than just Pirate 1. I know it's already passed here, but the scene of them lowering away the lifeboats was something that was really hard to find sound for. The hardest thing to find sound in these types of movies is just people just shouting orders. And so you really have to scour through YouTube and various movie clips to find sounds that are to your liking. Because this movie had a lot of very specific sound effects. So you can't just go to a sound library and get them. You have to really search the bowels of YouTube, if you will, to really get down to them. And that ended up being something that a lot of people resonated with, was the sound. Now, not to toot my own horn here or anything, but I think a lot of brick films just kind of rely on those stock sound effects that you can get on a stop motion studio or something like that. And it creates a very artificial feeling for your film. And I wanted to give my films a very cinematic feeling to them, so I made sure to really put emphasis onto the sound department. And I think that ended up working. This scene of Governor Lee and Stafford was originally scripted as taking place on the wheel. Well, not the wheel, I should really say the stern, but anyway. When I got around to filming that sequence, I realized that it would be really weird for them to have this conversation if Kathleen Graves and Lieutenant Bolton were just kind of standing there in the background. And so I moved it to Stafford's cabin to kind of give it a more personal feeling. And plus, it gets more use of the interior location for Stafford's cabin. This scene of the British unloading off of their ships was filmed the night before I started at Columbia. I remember that day in particular was just absolute hell to get through, because not only did I have to pack for Columbia, but I had to make sure that every sequence of the movie was filmed, because I didn't want to have to come back to it throughout the rest of the year. I just knew that if I didn't get these shots done now, then I wouldn't have the energy to go back and do them later on. And so I made sure that every sequence was filmed before I went up to school. And this was a sequence that I really forgot existed, and so I filmed this pretty much on a whim. It was incredibly rushed, but I think it turned out okay. I just filmed some various shots of the British looking evil, and there was that. The scene here of the trio and Redbeard was something that I was very tempted to cut out. It's humorous on its own, but it just kind of slows down the pacing. But I felt it was kind of necessary to show what Redbeard was up to, and it sort of gave the trio more of a reason for being in the movie, because Barnett's whole spiel of exposition would prompt Redbeard to figure out what's going on. And so I ultimately decided just to keep it in the movie. Funny enough, the source of inspiration for this sequence came from a very unlikely place. When Barnett kind of gives his whole explanation of the entire plot, that was actually inspired from a moment in Shark Tale. It's a horrendous movie. I think it's one of DreamWorks' worst. But there was one good line from the Larry King octopus character that I always thought was really funny. It's when the head of the shark mafia, God, that sounds so stupid, realizes that Jack Black is not actually a dolphin, but it's his son. And then the Larry King octopus kind of points out the obvious and says, hey boss, it's Lemmy, he disguised himself as a dolphin, and he kind of explains the whole plot. And I thought that was pretty funny, so I implemented that for Barnett. I think the joke works so well here because Holden just has such a innocent sounding voice that it's almost like a child. And so you could totally see him just kind of revealing all of their secret plans in a way. The trio is just so enjoyably stupid that I sometimes find them more entertaining than the actual plot of the movie, just because it's so different in tone. This ending line here where Barnett says, "I think we deserve a promotion," was actually based off believe it or not, a Cheetos commercial, where I think one of the characters says, "I think I deserve a promotion," and then the Cheeto mascot says, "You deserve to be fired." I thought that line was pretty funny, so I implemented that into the movie. It's pretty interesting where all your sources of inspiration can come from unlikely places as a Cheetos commercial. Now here we are at, I think, is one of my favorite sequences of the whole show here. It's the Islander battle. It was always my favorite part of the script because so much is happening here. Like all our characters are here at this particular field and everything is clear and the stakes are high, and so I just love seeing that all come to fruition here. It's inspired by the best of the movie battles. It's inspired from Battle of Stirling mainly and Braveheart. The charging armies and the bright green fields are a homage to that sequence. You can especially tell the Braveheart inspiration when it gets to the hand-to-hand fighting later on. And Helm's Deep was a pretty big inspiration for this too, mainly with the archery aspect of it. The Islanders are very reminiscent of the elves defending the causeway at Helm's Deep. Another inspiration was the Indian Battle of Spartacus, where they come toe-to-toe with the Roman army. I just thought the visuals of the bright green hills contrasted with the bloody fighting was something that I thought was really cool, and so I kind of paid tribute to that here as well. The only thing that I regret about the sequence looking back is that there's not enough Islanders in the background. When people see the scene here, they think that there's like less than 50 Islanders holding that river, but that's not true at all. The script stated that there were like 3,000 to 4,000 of them there. And the British had much more soldiers, and they outnumber them 1,000,000,000 to 12 or some shit like that. So yeah, it was supposed to be a full-fledged battle here. But I'm not sure that was really communicated that well. I should have done an overhead shot of the river there, where we could show hundreds of superimposed Islander minifigures defending the river. I don't know, maybe there'll be a special edition one day, where I can have CGI aliens screaming into the frame for you. Now originally the role of the artillery in the first couple drafts was very different. I wrote that Stafford didn't use the artillery until the very last moment, but then I looked back and realized, well, that's kind of dumb. I mean, if you have all this artillery here, why not bomb the Islanders to hell and just get on with it? So I wrote it that the artillery was still being unloaded, and so that explained why they're doing this reckless battle with the Islanders. Because Stafford's a man of efficiency, he wouldn't fight these guys unless he had to, and so I wrote it that he had to. The pressure from Governor Lee existed before, but now I kind of pumped it up. Now he knows that if he doesn't have a successful victory, then Governor Lee's got to shut him down. So now there's more of an objective for Stafford than just kind of being the bad guy in the battle, you know. It was a minor change, but it was a change that I felt was very well needed. Really kind of shows the might of the British forces, that just when you think that they've been defeated, they swing out that other arm and they completely take out their enemy. They're a strong force to be reckoned with. I love the shots here of the British just kind of assembling their ranks. It really shows how just efficient they are in their military aspects. It would have been easy just to have them kind of mindlessly march across the field, but I wanted kind of to show how organized they were as a fighting force. You know, there's one force that goes across the field, and there's another that stays behind as a reserve, and so on and so forth. So it was a great opportunity to kind of show the audience just who this enemy is, you know. For this fife and drum tune here, the Girl I Left Behind Me, that was originally from the Waterloo soundtrack, but the track I used for the rough cut seemed just a bit too patriotic and too loud, and so I changed it to just this standard field tune here, which I felt was a bit more appropriate than that overly glorious thing from the Waterloo soundtrack. It was just another one of those things that made the world building kind of seem a bit more real. Now, shooting battle sequences like this is always really difficult because there's really so much you can do before it becomes boring. Two armies duking it out just has only so much entertainment value. Eventually, it's just going to become exhausting for the audience. And so my approach is that I write battle sequences like I do dialogue sequences. You know, there's different turning points and beats within it. I try to have the tide kind of turn back and forth. Like at one point you'll think the good guys are winning, and then at the other point you'll think that the bad guys have the upper hand. You know, and I do that approach here. Like at first the Islanders kind of have the upper hand in the sequence with their arrows, and the British kind of bring out their muskets and they're kind of taking the field for a little bit. But then when the melee comes, the British are just getting their asses completely handed to them. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't one-sided. I want to make sure it kind of turned back and forth so that the audience isn't just kind of bored. Because if it's easy for the Islanders, then why should we care? And on the opposite end of that, if the British just kind of steamroll through them, why should we care about it? So it's essential to kind of keep the balance shifting back and forth so your audience isn't bored by it. Looking back, I really do like the sound work it did in the sequence. It seems very chaotic and confusing, which is what a battle during the 18th century would have looked like. And Kiefer especially has such a commanding voice here. He really sounds like an officer shouting out orders. He doesn't sound like an actor just delivering lines. His performance is just another aspect that makes the battle sequence more immersive. During the battle, I made sure to cut back to Stafford and Joffrey, because no matter how good your battle sequence is, it's eventually going to get boring, so there should be something to cut back to. You don't necessarily have to cut down the sequence when you cut away, but something that's going around the same time that you cut away to is beneficial to have during a big action sequence like this. And more importantly, it shows that the pressure is still on and Stafford has to get through the Islanders if he ever hopes to get to the locker. So it really shows you just how far he's willing to go to get to this goal. He's willing to send in an entire corps just to push through these Islanders, which a corps wouldn't really exist back then. That was more of a Napoleonic system. So if this was a more historically accurate movie, he'd be sending in the British equivalent of a corps in the early 18th century. So that's just one of the many inaccuracies in the movie. This little section where they go to the hand-to-hand fighting was a vision I had in my head even before a single word was typed in the script. I think this part existed in the original comics, but I could be wrong. But anyway, it was a really crucial sequence to get right, because you need to show how ferocious the Islanders are in their combat skills. I suppose the whole melee aspect is a little far-fetched, because I highly doubt a British officer would ever order his men to charge straight into an enemy, even during the clusterfuck of the 18th century. I doubt that would have happened, but still, it's a fun little visual. Something that was especially tricky about this sequence was animating the Islanders with their spears. It's a problem that we didn't expect to have. I think we did the swords okay in the end, but the spears were something we can never quite get down right. They're not really meant for dueling, they're meant for, stabbing your enemy. So that led to a real difficulty when animating the sequence, because how do you animate an Islander with a spear fighting a British soldier with a musket or a sword? Kahuka especially was difficult because he had to get some really mean kills in there. The animation with the spears really becomes a problem when Kahuka duels Stafford. You can kind of see that it's not really meant to duel swords. It's definitely not atrocious, but it's not something I'm quite proud of either. Another big issue that was found during filming was how did the British decide to ultimately withdraw? Because the script just says they fight and fight until some bugler sounds a retreat. So it was a difficulty figuring out just how much was enough, It was eventually decided just to have the Islanders kind of flank them from the right. It's a bit of a cop-out, but it's easier for the British to withdraw because they're getting surrounded. You gotta kind of make that call there. Now, this was a little beat here that I'm not sure was conveyed that well. After the British retreat, the Islanders just kind of stand still, which is what they're supposed to do. But then Gabriel kind of gets hyped up and says, "We can take them, come on, let's go!" And they charge across the field, and then Kahuka would say, "Stop, what are you doing?" And that way the artillery would come out and they would shoot down on them. It was supposed to be implied that they could have won if they had just stood still there, but because they charged out, the artillery was now within range. So in a way, Gabriel was kind of responsible for them losing the battle. I'm not sure if that particular aspect really got across in the final cut. Maybe I could have further emphasized the consequences of that decision there. I don't know. This whole bit here of Lieutenant Bolton kind of hesitating to give the order was inspired by a deleted scene from Return of the Jedi that I really like. It's a scene in which Moff Jared, I think that's what his name was given an order by the Emperor to blow up Endor, and then he said, "But we have a lot of our troops down there," and the Emperor said, "You will fire on that moon, Commander." And it was a really good scene, and I'm kind of bummed they cut it out. It would have added a lot more tension to that final battle there. So I wanted to kind of pay tribute to that here, while also kind of referencing The Last Samurai, how they bring out the Gatling guns at the last minute. I think it's a really effective sequence because it kind of shows the British just aren't all bad guys and they do have some humanity in them. If I was writing this today, I would have expanded Bolton's part a bit more because he doesn't really have much to do, but he has this crucial scene that kind of comes out of nowhere. And then he kind of immediately reverts back to being a villain when he fights Gabriel. I don't know, it kind of feels like a bit of a missed opportunity, if you will. We're also really starting to get a sense of how Stafford is kind of losing his mind. With the exception of murdering Gabriel's parents, you could make the slight argument that he was doing everything within reason up to this point. I mean, yeah, imperialism always sucks, but he wasn't doing anything that was explicitly evil until now. This is where he really starts to reveal his true colors, and that under that bright, polished admiral's uniform is just a monster. This is the moment where there's really no turning back for him. And now we're on to the chase sequence here. Well, not really a chase, but you get the idea. I was worried that this was going to be a bit awkward when I was filming it, because it's kind of just a chase scene and there's not really a whole lot going on. Because essentially it's just a minute of Gabriel running after Stafford on his horse. But I think it turned out well when I was editing it. I think the music track from the Ghost in the Darkness really makes this scene here. Of course, this is kind of inspired from the Battle of Falkirk and Braveheart, where Wallace attempts to go after Longshanks there, but obviously he fails in that regard. And so does Gabriel, kind of. It's interesting how this two-sentence little description in the script became like this minute-long sequence. That's just really stuff you don't really think about. I think the script came out to 102 pages, but even then I knew it was going to be a pretty long movie. And those 2 to 3 sentence little action descriptions there, those turned into these elaborate sequences that I didn't really think about. And speaking of action sequences here, this is what we call the camp sequence. It's very much inspired by that scene in The Patriot where Gabriel ambushes Tabington's dragoons. And I wanted to do something similar here, where Stafford was kind of caught with his pants down. I absolutely despised animating this fight. It's probably the most difficult sequence to do in the entire shoot. Most of this was filmed around March or April of 2021, so about right smack dab in the middle of production there. The reason this was so frustrating was because I wanted the sword animation to look really good. And I got so frustrated because the animation just didn't quite look right. It was pretty stiff and robotic, and they were moving only one frame at a time, and it was just not the thing I wanted for this high-paced action sequence here. There were a lot of bloopers and outtakes when I filmed this sequence here. When I animate sequences, it's rare that I'll need a second take, because I'm usually satisfied with the first one, which is not something you're really supposed to do when shooting a live-action film, but fuck you, this is my movie. But for this sequence here, it was pretty common to do 4 or 5 takes before I was satisfied with one. And it wasn't just simple shots where it was easy to set back up. These were very elaborate and complicated shots here. So doing them again was a pretty big hassle. But I think it turned out alright in the end. I wanted the scene to kind of further demonstrate how much of a skilled fighter Stafford is. I didn't want a mustache-twirling officer bad guy like Lord Cutler Beckett. I wanted someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, who was refined but also very ferocious when he needs to be. You know, it's kind of a cliche in these movies where the main bad guy will let his minions do the fighting for him, and he'll just kind of stand in the rear and maybe fire off a pistol or something. But I wanted to kind of make Stafford into a very formidable foe, and this scene kind of further demonstrates that. In terms of VFX, this was a sequence that Elliot just wanted to tear his hair out on. And I think his frustration is kind of reflected on the ways that people die in the sequence. It's pretty bloody, it's Tarantino levels of violence. But he did a fabulous job in the end, and this sequence is one of his highlights. Though admittedly, we may have gone a bit too far in a few places, as George Lucas would like to say. This was also a sequence that I cut down just a tad, because the fighting is fun, but it gets a little redundant. There was one shot with a bugler that was kind of meant to pay homage to the legend, where he'd get shot through the trumpet, but that was kind of cut out for pacing reasons. And it also explained why later on in the sequence there were just a shit ton of troops that came out of nowhere. There were a few lines in this fight that Nick Baca forgot to record. I was debating on if I was going to cut them out or not, but I decided to contact him anyway, and he got them in. The thing that I was worried about is that there was a year and a half in between his lines there, so I was worried that his voice would sound different, but thankfully he sounds pretty much the same. The one thing he never did was record those fighting grunts I wanted from him, so I had to fill in for a few of those myself, and there's unfortunately a few times where that's quite noticeably not Nick Baca doing those fighting grunts. But it's only for a brief few moments, so hopefully it's not that distracting. I kind of gave up on this three-way duel between Graves, Gabriel, and Redbeard, because I was just completely exhausted by that point. The script made a much bigger deal of this than what it ended up being in the final movie, but I figured there were more important sword fights to come, and so I just kind of pushed this one to the side. Which is one of the reasons why the animation looks a bit more shitty than what it normally does. Something that was also kind of altered from the original script was the way that Captain Graves dies here. Originally, his death was a lot less remarkable than what it is in the final film. If memory serves me correctly, I believe it was actually Gabriel that made the final killing blow. I think he was like stabbed in the stomach or something, and that was just the end of it. But I changed my mind on that since this is really more of a Redbeard's fight here. So I had Graves get decapitated so his death would be a bit more memorable. And I think this decision was a good one since it got quite a reaction from the crowd when it was first screened. I remember that Nick especially was surprised when he saw his death scene there. I don't think that he was quite expecting that. But overall, I think it was a good decision to cut his head off because it led to a much more memorable way to dispose of a character. And now we begin the Stafford and Kahuka fight here. This is a scene that I have a lot of regrets about looking back because it feels kind of tacked on. You know, you're already kind of tired of the fighting at that point. What I really should have done was I should have intercut between the Graves duel and the Stafford and Kahuka duel to make the momentum keep on going. You just got done watching a very long duel sequence and now you're on to the next one. It just kind of feels redundant. For what it is though, it's not a terrible sequence, just one I wish I could have improved upon. Something that I tried to convey was that Stafford was very close to losing this duel. I wanted to show that his blows were becoming weaker and that he was kind of fearful. I'm not sure if that was really communicated that well, but just kind of to show that he's not always invincible. And this whole fight here just shows how Stafford can make mistakes. There was actually an abandoned concept for the sequence where the log would keep on falling down the chasm and it would keep on shifting towards one side of the cliff and they would fight at an angle. But when it got time to filming that, it was just too impractical to really realize, so they just kind of fight while it's pulling it straight so I can animate the fight better. This is also a fight that I had to trim down a bit because Kahuka was really kind of crazy in this fight. Like he would do all sorts of flips, like almost like a Jedi. And there was one point where he fell off the log and he grabbed onto it, and Stafford would kind of swing his sword to try and kill him, but he kept on dodging it. But it just got to a point where it was too goofy, so it was kind of trimmed down a bit. I guess that's another thing for the eventual deleted scenes video. Something that I was kind of shocked about here was that Kahuka's death, well, not really death, but when he gets stabbed, that actually got quite a bit of reaction from the crowd when it premiered. I remember that someone said, "Oh no, I liked him." It was really kind of surreal that people were so attached to this character that had only 2 or 3 scenes prior. That just shows you the power of acting, I suppose. This bit here where the log collapses down the chasm there, that was something I had to refilm quite a bit. There were a few different ways I tried doing this. There was one experiment I tried where I would place my phone and I'd just hit record and then I'd drop the log down the chasm and I'd just record in slow motion. And that didn't really work, so I eventually just decided to move it frame by frame with my hand off camera. That's typically something you want to avoid, but I think it works fine because it's such a brief shot. It's not really that important. And plus, by that point, I had done that shot about 5 or 6 times, so I was pretty exhausted because I'd have to rebuild the log like every time it collapsed. So I was just tired. We kind of already skipped this, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. There was a whole sequence here that was actually filmed that we ended up cutting out. It was supposed to be where Gabriel and Redbeard were running back from the battle of the camp, and it was written that Broadside would see him and he'd say, "Stop right there," and he'd climb out onto his horse and there'd be a whole chase scene. But as Kiefer's line started to come in, Broadside evolved into a much more sympathetic character than what he was really intended to be. But I still wanted the chase, so I figured who else could be put there? So I chose a random British officer to kind of fill in that role, and we actually filmed this whole chase scene, but when we were assembling it together, it just really didn't fit well with the rest of the edit, because we just go from this dramatic death of a hero to this long, complicated chase scene, and it really didn't fit tonally, so we ended up scrapping it. You can see the remnants of this sequence in the final film. There's a shot where Sinkei, I think, is helping Gabriel up the riverbank, and you can briefly see the corpse of a black horse in the background. What was supposed to happen is that Gabriel was supposed to go all Patriot style, and he'd grab a spear and he'd throw it into the horse there, and the officer would collapse to the ground. But it was just one of those things that we'd cut out, and I think it was the right call in the end, because the sequence just flows so much better now when we cut from Kahuka falling down the chasm right to the retreat of the Islanders. It just keeps the momentum going, which I think is a good thing. It was also a shame because Elliot did all the VFX work for it, and it's always a pain when you do so much work on something but it ends up being cut out of the film. That was the same case with the shark sequence I previously mentioned. Hopefully we can put it onto the deleted scenes reel when that eventually comes out. This tiny sequence here of the British assembling in the camp is something that I really enjoy. It shows the audience that even though they almost lost this really crucial battle, they're able to regroup the numbers pretty quickly. They just keep on coming and coming, and they're a pretty formidable foe. It just further emphasizes how many of them there truly are. This whole sequence of the islanders on the beach here and kind of gathering up their corpses, This was filmed very early on in the shoot. I want to say September or October of 2020. Kind of filmed around the same time as the initial landing and the whole Spanish fight on the beach here. Kind of around the same time period. You can tell it's kind of early on because I didn't have a lot of Islander minifigures yet at that time, so I had to cram them all into one shot. I had to really carefully position them to kind of give the illusion that there were more of them, because there were really only like 5, I think, if my memory serves me correctly. But for the battle scene, I eventually had to cave in and get more on eBay. I guess in the traditional sense, there wasn't really a budget on this film, but there were a considerable amount of money that was spent on the getting the Lego sets. The vintage sets from the 90s are especially expensive, so I really had to kind of save up money to get them. There wasn't really a fixed amount that I couldn't go over, so I was pretty thankful for that. I was also pretty thankful that I didn't have to spend any money on voice actors, so that was really a cost saver there. Oh, speaking of voice actors, I don't think I've talked about Hans yet. It's kind of a weird time to talk about him, but I suppose better late than never. Hans is played by John Pimsel. I met him through Oscar Johnson because he's cast Pimsel in a couple of stop motions before. He was cast kind of as a last resort because I tried a few different people in the Hans role. Holden Meese, who plays Barnett, was actually up for Hans originally. If you go back to my announcement video, you can hear him say, I'm playing Hans in the upcoming pirate film. Holden was always good at doing funny accents and voices, so I didn't really hold the audition for him, which was a pretty big mistake, because when he recorded his lines for him, it was just incredibly goofy. It was like right out of an SNL skit or something, so it became apparent that we needed to recast him. We tried a few different people in the role, but they just weren't really working. I eventually settled for Pimsel, and he did this kind of foreign-sounding voice. It wasn't really Dutch, but it didn't really matter. If he could convince me, then he could probably convince a general audience, so I left him in. I don't think it's a role that he particularly enjoyed, because Hans is kind of a stale character who's kind of there for exposition, but I think he does a pretty good job in that role. I guess the whole experience was awkward for both of us, because I typically have at least some sort of relationship with my voice actors, even if I haven't met them before. I can usually take time to get to know them and know what their strengths and weaknesses are, but for Pimsel, I just kind of met him on a whim, and I just asked him if he could do it, and he said sure. There wasn't really much communication there, which is not really something you ever want to do with an actor. But I was just so desperate to cast this role and move on, so I didn't really give much thought to it. Which is kind of the reason why Hans doesn't really have a lasting impression on the audience. I didn't really give time for Pimsel to find his character, which was a mistake on my part. So this is my apology of sorts, if you will. This part of Stafford and the British entering the village was something that I almost refilmed. I wasn't really happy with the lighting in it, but there were so many other things that I wanted to get done in film, so I just kind of left that in the movie. I'm still not proud of it now, but I had to move on. There were just so many other things that I had to get done at that point, so I just left it in. And now we're entering the portion where Governor Lee dies. Lee's death scene was actually not something that was in most earlier drafts we wrote. Originally, Lee was kind of supposed to film the Broadside role of questioning Stafford, and Broadside was going to be just another henchman that followed orders. At the end of the film, it was actually going to be Lee that surrendered to the French and not Broadside. But when I started writing later drafts of the movie, I felt the film lacked a lot of tension in the third act. Well, not really third act, I guess it's more appropriately end of the second act, early third act, if you will. But anyway, you get the idea. I also didn't think that we were demonstrating Stafford's decline into madness that well, so I figured, what if we killed off Lee? I wrote it into the third draft, and it was something that I didn't think would stick. When I presented the idea to Eli, he actually really liked it, surprisingly, and so decided to keep it in the script. This is something especially that Jack had just a blast recording. He really liked recording his gargling blood and his death screams. I had to kind of tone it down a bit in the final film, but there were a few takes where he really got into it. Originally the scene was just kind of supposed to play out as it was filmed, but I decided to kind of tweak with the audio bit in editing, and it led to this really great echo effect of Stafford when he keeps on hacking away at Lee's corpse. It benefited the scene a lot, and it also reflected on Stafford's mental state. It shows just how far he's willing to go to preserve his legacy. This was a scene that Elliot had some difficulty on in the VFX department. I remember it was tricky for him to motion track the blood on Stafford's face because he kept on moving around a lot. Despite him wanting to pull his hair out, I think it turned out quite well. This scene was heavily inspired by that one scene in the Patriot where Benjamin Martin hacks away at the corpse of a British soldier and just keeps on going at it until the blood spurts out in his face and the music kind of drowns out his screams. So I wanted to pay homage to that in this film. Eli was a very good screamer, That sounds kind of weird to say, I know, but he was really good at recording his screams when he hacked away at Governor Lee. I didn't really have to do much directing there. The tension here between Broadside and Stafford is something that I just love. Both actors play it really well. You can especially tell Kiefer that he sees right through Stafford's lies and he knows that he murdered Governor Lee. This scene and the scene prior where he looks at all the corpses on the battlefield is something that was made to make him think that he might be on the wrong side. I think Broadside's a character that a lot of people can relate to because he's just a guy that just is trying to do his job. He just wants to follow orders and do his duty to his men. He doesn't want to carry out atrocities or anything like that. And we'd all like to stick up to our boss and our shitty jobs, so I think Broadside's a character that resonated with a lot of people. A lot of that can be attributed to Austin Kiefer because he really was able to transform this character. I know I kind of sound like a broken record here, but he really was able to turn this character into something more than what he was ever intended to be. It's pretty amazing that one single actor can completely transform a director's vision of a character, and he can almost completely change the whole movie. He saw something that I never saw in Broadside, and I applaud him for finding that for me. The violin piece here from Master and Commander is a piece that I really like. It's really sorrowful, but not to the extent that a typical Hollywood score is. It's really depressing, and it further hammers on the fact that Stafford has just won. The British have just completed this great victory here. And now that they have the Shard, they're going to be pretty much impossible to stop. And so it just makes the entire situation even more hopeless for our heroes here. The sequence that's coming up is something that we call the Islander burning sequence. It's pretty much where Stafford just unleashes everything he has, and he basically almost wipes out an entire culture. It's very much inspired by that scene in The Patriot where Cavington burns down the church full of women and children inside of it. Now looking back on it, this is a sequence that I do think I went a bit too far on. I mean, it is necessary to see how evil these guys are, but I don't think we needed to see quite this much brutality in our overall fun and action adventure film here, you know? Really kind of creates a contrast of tone, because I think in the scene prior to this, we had like a couple gags of Mr. Stone, and then we have this entire genocide of the culture. It really doesn't fit well, does it? This was also something that Elliot just said holy shit on, because he's normally a quiet guy, but even he had a very strong reaction to this sequence here. He was like, "You really want me to do this? Okay." This is something that he strongly advised for me to trim out, because he thought that this would kind of really be unnecessary, but I didn't budge. The only thing that I kind of slightly conceded on was I allowed him to put a flame into the scene where they're decapitating the islanders there. That was probably a bit too much to see in the movie. Just a little quick note here. The British were evil, but they were never this bad. This behavior is something that you would probably more associate with Spanish conquistadors back in the 1500s rather than British sailors in the 1700s. The Spanish might have done this to the Incas, but the British would have probably never done this to this scale here. But it's good for dramatic effect, and it just kind of further hammers in that Stafford is this absolute bastard of a villain. If they can do all this damage without the Kraken, then who knows what they can do with one, you know? It just kind of further emphasizes how many cultures will be like this if Stafford gets a hold of the Kraken. I imagine that Stafford would probably do something like this to mainland Europe if he was given the chance to. I mean, what wouldn't that guy do? This whole death scene with King Kahuko was something that I kind of regret. Looking back on it, I think it might be a bit too sappy. Like, we don't really need this emotional death scene in this point in the film, but I think all the actors do a fine job of delivering their lines, so I kept it in. And plus it gives a good farewell to the Kahuga character. I'm not really sure how he survived that stab wound and him falling down hundreds of feet down a chasm, but whatever, it's a movie, who cares? Hollywood has pulled more ridiculous bullshit than I do in this movie. The scene also kind of does a good job of hammering in just how Ron Gabriel was and how big of a fuck up that was when he made the choice to charge the British in the battle. How he basically, this is all his fault. And he'll have to come to terms with that for the rest of his life. He can only watch as this king of civilization dies right in front of him. I do like how the scene kind of gives Sinkei a bit more depth, because he's kind of really a still character up until this point. He doesn't really have too much of a personality, but here you get to learn a bit more about him and how he deeply respects his culture, and how even when it's passed on to him, he refuses because he has hope for the future. So we really learn more about who this character is, rather than just the cool tribal warrior figure, you know. Now that I think about it, Legolas was a pretty big inspiration for the Sinkei character. I mean, think about it. He's the son of a king. Well, not really the son, but he's related to royalty. He's a very skilled archer, and he accompanies a group of people on a mission. I think the similarities there are pretty striking. Now, Christopher Seaman does a good job of delivering his lines here, but the only thing he couldn't do quite right was cry. When you're directing a film, you really don't want your actors to cry that much because you run the risk of it becoming goofy. So you really have to decide of when crying is appropriate to do. But in this scene, it was just kind of unavoidable. And it just really wasn't working, so I had to settle for a stock crying sound effect. It doesn't really sound good at all, and it's one of the few things that I really cringe at when I watch the movie because it's just so out of place, and you can tell it's not Christopher. Comes off as unintentionally comedic. I'm not sure why I thought that'd be a good idea there. This speech here that Stafford gives was something that was reworked a few times. I was afraid that the music track, Marat's Crown from Prince Caspian, would go on a bit too long, so I asked Eli if he could extend the speech a little bit. And so he recorded a few reels of it where he kind of improvised a few things in the speech, like "Glory to the Empire" or some shit like that. But really wasn't needed because the track was just short enough. And so I just kind of used the original recording that I had him do, and I think it works just fine. This overhead shot here of the British kind of marching out was one of the last VFX shots that was done for the movie. I wanted a shot that kind of really showed off just how big the British Army was, and so I asked Elliot if he could do this overhead shot of the British marching out. I took a photo of a green base plate, and I green screened a bunch of soldiers, and I asked him if he could superimpose them onto it. It took a few tries, but we finally got it right, and it was one of the last VFX sequences that we did. It was a necessary shot because it just showed off how big the army is and how much of a formidable foe they are. This isn't just a small expeditionary force, this is a legit army. And we just needed that shot there to really demonstrate that. This scene here with the kind of assemble the fellowship, this was something that was filmed pretty early on too. I want to say August of 2020, so very early on in the shoot there. Even though it's kind of cheesy, I do really like the scene. It kind of hammers in the message that even though things might seem hopeless, you gotta try your best anyway. It's a good message to have, especially during these interesting times, let's say. Things might seem really bad, but just give it your all and hope for better tomorrow. This is a scene where all the characters know what they're signing up for and they're willing to do it anyway. Something that was cut here, and you'll see it later on, is the what I like to call the hero shot. It appeared in the first teaser trailer, and it was kind of a panning shot where we'd show all 8 of our characters there. And it was in the assembly for a very long time, but it was just decided that it looked a bit cheesy, and so we decided to scrap that. Also, it didn't really look good either. It looked a bit choppy. I suppose most of this film does anyway, so I guess it wouldn't make much of a difference. Something that I will talk about here is the rift between Gabriel and Willingham. Looking back, I think it's pretty unnecessary. It doesn't really add anything to the story. Like, these two characters are just kind of mad at each other, and then they part their ways for like less than 5 minutes, and then he's back. I really could have cut that out and wouldn't have made any difference. I don't know why it's in there. I guess to create some tension. But at the end of the day, you don't really need that. I think the tension already comes from the British and Stafford. I don't know, just kind of something that I regret putting in there. Because he comes back like in the scene here and he joins their crew. So I'm not sure what I was thinking there. Oh, look at that lovely walking animation there. My God. That's something I've been criticized for in this film and all my other works, is that I don't move their legs. And yeah, that's a valid criticism. I'm a lazy motherfucker. I'm not even going to try and defend myself on that one. It just, all the walking scenes look pretty terrible. I guess I'm not really meant for stop motion because I'm a very impatient person and I just like to get things moving along. I already went on a spiel about my philosophy of animation in the Legend commentary, so if you really want to hear my thoughts about that, you should probably check that one out. I'm not going to waste any time here since there's a lot of stuff I need to talk about, so I'm just going to move on. This scene here with the trio was something that was very close to getting the axe. It doesn't really do a whole lot story-wise, except for establishing that Broadside is really dissatisfied with Stafford. But I guess it adds a bit of comedy to the picture, because at this point we need some comedy after going through all that depressing stuff there. So I guess it's fine for what it is. A line that always makes me laugh, and no one else likes it, is the line, "Did the governor go on holiday?" I just, that cracks me up, the way that Holden delivers that. And that's a line that no one reacts to, and that makes me really sad. Yeah, that was the other big thing about this movie, is that there were a lot of lines that I thought would get a laugh that didn't, and there were lines that I didn't think would get a laugh, and they did. Kind of opposite effect there. It just proves that your audience is always going to be unpredictable. Something to note here about this set is that this was a set that took a pretty long while to create, and it was a shame because this was only really used once. There's only one scene that takes place below decks in the British ships, and I think it looks pretty good for what it is there. I think it's very distinct from the below decks of the Barracuda, where they have the gray tiling, and I think the black tiling of the British ships really kind of brings out the evil in them. You know, here I am rambling about the tiles. God, if you're still listening to this, you deserve a medal. It'll be interesting to see how many people actually listen to this commentary track. I doubt it's going to be a lot, but who knows? Maybe we'll get some viewers. This whole Council of War scene here was something that was just a nightmare to get done. Originally, it was scripted that this meeting would take place on the wheel of the ship. Well, not really the wheel, but the stern, if you will. And they'd kind of lay the map out on the wheelhouse, and they'd point to various stuff. And it was just going to be very impractical to put all that many characters on the back of the small end of the Barracuda. So it was changed to the inside of the cabin, and it got more use out of that location there. And also it made more sense. This is a bit more of a private meeting. Something that was just a pain was getting in Cade and Adam's lines in. They always recorded their lines, but for some reason we could never agree on the amount of British ships. At one point it was 20, one point it was 150, and we were trying to decide what an appropriate number would be. Eventually we just settled on 80, and every time we settled on a number, they'd have to re-record the line, because Hamish says, I don't know, maybe about 80, and then Adam says 80, and they record it as, I don't know, maybe around 50, and 50, and so if you get what I mean there, so we'd have to re-record that and record, and it was just a nightmare to get that done. And so that's why the sequence was one of the last to be completely edited together, because of that number exchange there. I hope you're still following me. I know that was pretty confusing. This sequence is also especially important because it establishes the idea that the locker seals up when you throw in the shard. Kind of very Lord of the Rings-esque there. I probably should have made that a bit more clear, like earlier on, but I guess it's fine at this point in the movie. This transition here was just a bitch to get done right. We kept on experimenting with a few different ways that we could transition from the river to the locker, but none of them really looked right. I eventually had to settle for the simpler route, and we just took a picture of the blue background, and then we transitioned to the gray background, and we panned down. I know that was pretty simple there, but so sometimes the simple transition is the best one. Something to also note here is that the effect of the fog was really difficult to get done. That particular aspect was done by me in Adobe Premiere because it was just too much to ask Elliot to add fog into all of his VFX work because he had a heavy plate as well as our other artists, so I just kind of had to fill in that in myself. And the reason it was so difficult is because the only really good one we could find on YouTube as a green screen, it had it as like a 10-second loop, and so every time you'd have to go back and restart it. But the problem with that was that when you restarted it, it was very apparent, and so you had to go into like 3 seconds, and you had to get a bunch of different layers on it, and it was just complicated. The timeline on Premiere looked very cluttered, to say the least. In the script, it was written that the locker was very foggy, and the final battle was going to have fog like all around it, but this proved to be too impractical to go through the entire battle sequence and just add a bunch of fog to it, so that was kind of scrapped. Now, this argument here with Broadside and Stafford is a scene that I really love. Both actors are just really giving their all, and you can tell they're very just pretty much done with each other's shit. Broadside is increasingly frustrated that Stafford is just going too far, and Stafford knows that he can get away with pretty much anything he wants to at this point. So it leads to a pretty great scene between those two characters there. Something that's kind of funny about this scene is that there was quite a lot of debate on Stafford's hat. I remember that Elliot thought it was pretty goofy that Stafford had that feather in his hat, but I kept it in because I thought it kind of really showed that he's taking on the governor role now and he's dressing in Governor Lee's old hat. It shows the audience that he wishes to appear more lavish now. He wants to show just how much more power he has now versus than what he was when he was just an admiral. But of course Broadside sees right through his sketch there, and he knows that Governor Lee didn't give him the command. He knows that he just murdered him. And here it is. The Kraken finally comes home. This is a moment that I intended to have in pretty much every draft of the script I wrote. Because at some point, this creature has to emerge out of the depths, and it's basically how I imagined it. The Kraken was a huge challenge for both of us because it's really the first fully computer-generated character that I've ever done in any work I've ever done. God, that was a tongue twister there, wasn't it? We struggled with just how we were going to bring this on screen. I originally wanted to just use a PNG of Lego Octopus, but Elliot said, no, we aren't doing that. So that was a good call there. So he was able to assemble this massive creature from pretty much nothing. I believe he used Blender, I think. Whatever he used, it looked pretty good, and I'm beyond satisfied with it. Even though the Kraken does still look good, we made an effort to kind of obscure it with fog, because even though it does look up to standard, we still have to kind of hide the fact that it's a completely CGI character, because no matter how good your CGI looks, at the end of the day, it's still fake looking. So kind of obscuring it with the fog made it seem more real. And we also made sure like not to just have a giant pink octopus. We wanted to kind of add some layers to it. So we made it more grayish looking to make it look like it had seen some shit. And I believe if you look close enough, there's a couple of scars on it. So it kind of shows just how old of a creature this is. It's not like your standard Hollywood Kraken that you see in so many high seas adventure movies. The file sizes for this were just enormous. I believe that one shot was like 15 gigabytes or something like that. So that's why it doesn't appear in too many shots here. All things considered, the Kraken kind of becomes useless from this point on, doesn't he? He just kind of stands there. It doesn't really do much. The explanation for that is that you have to point the shard in a direction, and it'll follow the beam of light and attack the ship or whatever. But that's kind of redundant there, isn't it? Because by the time you set up the shard, like what's stopping an enemy ship from, attacking you? So it's kind of like the same thing in Jurassic World, Fallen Kingdom, where you have to point a laser to make the Indoraptor attack something. Just kind of extra steps. I guess it would have been cool to see the Kraken kind of partake more in the final battle, like maybe he destroys a few ships, but that was just going to be impractical to do. Besides, at this point, the story is just on what the Kraken could do versus on what it will do. I know it's kind of a cop-out there, isn't it? The real reason is that we just didn't want to do that much work there. Something that was also kind of difficult was getting sounds with the Kraken. It sounds kind of straightforward, you just go to YouTube and look up Kraken sounds, but for some reason the sounds that were on YouTube just didn't quite seem right. So we had to go to some really obscure sources there. I think there's a couple of dragon sounds in there, and I think there might be a few dinosaur sounds if my memory serves me correctly. So we went to some weird places to find sounds, which I suppose is normal because if you look on the behind the scenes in most movies, the Foley artists they go to some really unique places to get sounds. I just kind of cheat and I go to YouTube. This whole bit here with Sinkei destroys the British ship, that was pretty tiring to do. The reason why Stafford doesn't use the Seahawk in the sequence is because the ship needed to be destroyed by Sinkei, so it could lead to a cool visual. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because Stafford has grown pretty attached to the Seahawk, so he would have probably used that, but I don't know. It's a cool moment, so who cares? The reason it was so challenging was because of mainly the sound department, because you have to find all the various shouts and orders, like after the ship sinks, like people yelling orders, stuff you don't really typically find on YouTube. I think I went to Titanic to get most of those sounds there. It kind of raises the question of just how were they standing on the ship when it got split in half? Now, I don't think they'd be able to really hold all these conversations and say, we're going on the Seahawk, I think they'd be sinking. That's just another one of the movie magic bits there. Something that was a particular challenge, and it doesn't matter which context it is, was doing the rowing animation. You can kind of see it here of Mr. Stone. It's pretty awkward to do. And also syncing that up with the sound is really tricky because you have to really match it up with the motion that Mr. Stone or whoever is doing when he hits the water. So that was a really big challenge to animate there. And also not to mention the boat itself because it moves a fuck ton. Like when you try to move the paddles, the boat will go over to the side, and you have to maintain the illusion that the boat's going in one direction. So that was there were several takes on those scenes there. And now we're entering the final battle sequence. This is just a monster of a sequence. It lasts, I think, upwards of 30 minutes or something. So that's longer than Helm's Deep, I think. So needless to say, we had our work cut out for us here. Something that's interesting to note is that this whole idea of them destroying a British ship was not actually in the original script. It was scripted that they'd be pursued by a British ship and then they'd immediately crash on the rocks. But I thought it was a bit too one-sided there. As I mentioned previously in the whole section with the Islander battle, what I like to do in my battles is kind of have turning tides, like at one point the pirates will win and at another point the British will kind of have the upper hand. So I try to do the same thing here, where they're initially winning, and you think they might stand a chance against the British, but then you remember that you're an idiot for thinking like that because the British have God knows how many ships. So I added this section on the day of filming, much to Elliot's horror. And it's just kind of there to balance out the battle and add a bit more meat to it. And I think it does its job well, because you at first think they're going to be victorious, but then you see that the tide is going to quickly turn here, as we will see here soon. Looking back on this final battle portion, it's something I kind of regret not cutting down a bit more, because it gets to the point where you're kind of exhausted and you just kind of say, okay, let's wrap this up here. Especially with the fight on the decks of the Barracuda, it just gets to the point where it's where there's a bit too much of it. There were a few bits we trimmed out, but not as much as we really should have. I like this little bit with Hans kind of trying to keep the Barracuda from crashing into the rocks. It gave his character a bit more to do, because in the original script, the British ships just kind of crashed into the Barracuda, and that was that. But I kind of beefed it up a bit more and made it kind of be a bit more of a struggle. God, that was a stutter there if ever there was one. And now you see where the inspiration for Patrick comes from. Speech impediments are a wonderful thing. But anyway, back to Hans here. He was the one character that kind of just disappeared in the background, so I wanted to give him something a bit more to do here. So this little duel here between the ships was written, well, not really duel, but I guess struggle would be a more appropriate word, was added into the script. Something that's interesting about this battle on the decks here was how it came together in editing. Because as it was filmed, I would film each portion in like 30-second intervals. Like I'd film the below deck stuff for 30 seconds and then I cut back to the upper decks for 30 seconds. But Elliot made the suggestion of cutting in between them, so to kind of quicken the pace a bit more. I said, why didn't I think of that? And so I did that into the final edit, and that's why the battle kind of moves quicker than what it normally would have. I like this scene here because it's more of a desperate fight than what we've really ever seen before in the movie. Because beforehand we just kind of got these flashy sword duels, but here this is kind of the fight for survival here. Like, they aren't fighting to look impressive, they're fighting to stay alive. Basically, it's more of a, how many soldiers can you take out before you get stabbed? What I made sure to do was add tiny bits of dialogue in here, just so it's not just a bunch of fighting. You have to remind the audience that this isn't just an action set piece, and that there are characters in a story that are still at work here. So it's just little moments like Hamish saying, get to the captain's cabin, or the beat where Benjamin will go downstairs, stuff like that. It was also important to keep the action centered on the characters. In big battle sequences like this, you don't want to have too many shots where there are just a bunch of random characters fighting, because that'll get really old and you're not really sure who to identify with. But if you focus on like individual moments of characters that you know, then you're a lot more invested in the battle sequence. Like, for example, there are a lot of shots of Redbeard just trying to stay alive, so that kind of adds a bit more tension. It's much better for audience to identify with the characters' individual struggles rather than a whole unit, fighting the battle. So I made sure to keep it focused on our central characters here. It just makes the battle seem more personal. Now, in this bit here where Benjamin goes downstairs, there's a pretty entertaining story that goes along with this here. I asked Oscar to do a fighting grunt reel when he goes downstairs here, but for some reason, as great as an actor as he is, he just couldn't grunt right. He would just turn in these takes where he was just screaming, and it was pretty funny, actually, because he would just be screaming at the top of his lungs, and your ears actually kind of hurt because these files just got so loud, so you had to kind of tone him down a bit to really listen to him. I just took the few good takes of him grunting, and they're in the final film now. You'll notice that there's not a whole lot of him grunting, because there wasn't a lot to use. I didn't want to ask him to do redos, because that would just be too much of a hassle to get done. Look at me, the lazy director. There were a few bits that we kind of chopped out of the sequence here, because originally much more emphasis was placed on the captain's cabin. Like, they were going to set up a barricade in there, and they were going to shoot at the British outside. But it just got to the point where the battle was running a bit too long, so I kind of had to chop that bit out. We also removed a lot of shots of Will Willingham fighting here, because it just got a bit too redundant. Like, we already get these good sword fighters, so we don't really need to have that hammered in. And here are the French. It took them long enough to get here. Yeah, they've kind of disappeared from the movie for a long time. I think they've been gone for almost 90 minutes here. Which I guess makes the surprise work even better, because you kind of forget about them, and so the surprise is genuine. A lot of the final battle was filmed pretty late on production. I want to say July, August 2021, so very late in the shooting schedule. So you can kind of tell that some of this is a bit rushed, because the plan was originally to have this movie out by August 31st before I went off to college, but that quickly became just not a goal we could realize, so it was pushed back, and then eventually we could have that March release date. So I ended up cramming in as many shots as I could, which really, now that I think about it, didn't make a whole lot of sense, because I was pushing back the movie anyway, so there wasn't really this rush to get it completed. I don't know. At least I got it done, so there's that. I love how the Patriot theme kind of comes back here. I guess that's what you would consider to be the movie's main theme. For The Legend, it was the Rough Riders theme, but for this movie, it's the Patriot theme. I didn't use a Patriot soundtrack as much as I would have liked. I would have liked to kind of build up some more musical motifs, as I call them, like have different themes for certain characters. I did that a bit in The Legend, but that concept was kind of abandoned here because it just really didn't work. I'd like to maybe experiment more with that in the future. Music is pretty important because it gives the film its own identity. The Legend had the Western adventure feel, and this film kind of has more of a high seas adventure-y kind of colonial feel with the Patriot theme. That's one of the things I kind of regret about this movie. I don't think the music was as well done as The Legend was. The Legend kind of had its own distinct personality. As flawed as The Legend may be, at least it did have kind of its own musical identity. While this film doesn't really have that, I can't ask someone to hum me the Heart of the Seas theme, but they could probably hum me the Legend theme if they really looked for it, because it's much more apparent. Here I go on another tangent. I should probably talk about the battle here. Like for most of my action sequences, there really wasn't a plan for this. There were no storyboards. Really all that we had was just the direction of the script, which was very minimal at best. So most of this fighting stuff here is mainly just improv. That's not something you ever want to do on a film like this, so don't follow my example. As a result, the tactics don't make a whole lot of sense. It's just mainly for what looks good on camera. So really, any sense of naval strategy is thrown out the window here. I imagine real battles of the 18th century would have looked nothing like this. I have to give huge props to Elliot here, because he never lost the momentum when he was doing the VFX work, because there were a lot of shots in these final battle that he had to deliver to me, and he never threw in the towel. I'm sure there were many points where he would just like to quit, but he kept on going, which I really appreciate that, because I couldn't have done this without him. I mean, it's just all the little stuff you don't think about. Like, every gun flash has to be added in later, so that's really time consuming, and he's very dedicated to his craft, which is great because he was very overworked in this battle sequence here. This scene where Sin K comes down and tells Mr. Stone to shoot at the rocks, the banter was originally supposed to be a bit longer there, but I cut it down in editing because it was just slowing down the pace of the battle. You know, we go from this huge action sequence, and then we're back inside to having a comedy time with Stone, and it just really didn't fit right, so it was trimmed down a bit. I think originally it ran for about 30 seconds, but we cut it down to, I think, 10 to 15. It was a good call, because that stuff belongs on the cutting room floor. This portion here, where the two French ships come in between the Seahawk, was something that was very close to being cut out. The reason being was that I wasn't sure how we were going to be able to pull this off. I almost didn't film it, but Elliot said, no, I can do it. So I gave my trust into him, and he delivered it to me. It just shows that nothing can stop Stafford from getting what he wants. Even when there's two French ships on either side of him, he'll still put up a fight. Destroying these ships, both French and British, was a absolute pain, because every time you destroy them, you have to reassemble them. So there's a couple of shots where some ships are missing sails, or some are missing little pieces in the bow section. That's because I knew I'd have to tear them down again, and I didn't really feel like reassembling them all, so that's why it looks like that. Tearing down any set is really hard to do, but it was especially hard because these were very old sets. These were from the early 90s, so it wasn't fun tearing those apart, but it had to be done. Pain is temporary, film is forever, as Peter Jackson would say. This whole section with the lifeboat here, where the trio tries to escape, was actually loosely inspired from the scene in World's End where Murtaugh and Mulroy try to escape from Davy Jones's ship. God, what's that thing called? I'm trying to remember. Oh wait, I'm an idiot. It's called The Flying Dutchman. God, that's my brain's fried. So anyway, I just like the concept of cutting to more comedic characters while there's a serious battle going on, so I kind of tried to do that here. Originally, it was scripted that the trio would lead through the stern, but that became very impractical when I was actually filming this because you can't fit a lifeboat on the stern of that tiny Imperial flagship set. So it was chosen to kind of be on one of the sides of the ship, which makes a lot more sense because why would you have a lifeboat on the stern of your ship? Kind of leads to a bit of a continuity error because it's the only lifeboat that appears in this film, so I guess the British and French aren't really concerned with safety on their vessels. They only have one lifeboat. I actually almost wrote another scene where the trio would try to avoid broadside ship and they'd have to jump into the water while their longboat got destroyed. But that was scrapped because at this point we really don't need them anymore for comic relief. They appear back again in the post-credits scene, but they're really not that useful anymore. This whole scene where Broadside chases the Barracuda through the rocks was actually inspired from The Last Jedi. There's a scene during the Battle of Crate where Rey flies the Falcon through a series of chasms and the TIE fighters follow. I really like that scene, so I kind of wanted to do something similar here. It's also kind of inspired from that scene in Return of the King where Legolas takes down the Mumakil. Of course, Sin-K kind of fills in the Legolas role here. It's fun to see heroes take out like big enemy vehicles, such as Luke in Empire Strikes Back when he takes down that AT-AT. Is it AT-AT or is it AT-AT? I never got a clear consensus on that. I shouldn't really be talking about Star Wars, I should be talking about the movie. So anyway, back to the film. This is just a fun little sequence, and it kind of gets rid of Broadside for a while during the ending climax. Because if he was commanding the battle, they probably would have won, and there wouldn't be this great French victory. There's a shot of Broadside coming up after the ship kind of breaks apart, where it comes out of the water. That almost wasn't filmed, but I included it in here because I was afraid people would think that Broadside died, you know? And it's not really what we want. So I had to include that moment in there. It's kind of a little bit where Broadside says, good game, you know? So I'm glad I included that little moment in there. It gives a bit more character to the Broadside. In a way, he kind of accepts the honor in his defeat. Something which Stafford is unable to do. Oh, when editing these brief scenes of the French fighting the British here, I made sure to keep it somewhat short when cutting them between the pirates here, because the French are not your main characters, the pirates are. So you got to make sure you don't lose sight of that in these huge battle sequences here. Because it's very easy to do that, so that's where the power of editing kind of comes in there. This scene here of the Seahawk kind of coming right in front of the Barracuda was something that confused a lot of people, and that's really my fault because I wasn't very clear on the whole geography of it all. But what's supposed to happen here is that the Barracuda will be right in front of the whirlpool, and then the Seahawk will pull basically right in front of the whirlpool, so they're kind of blocking their path. And so that's the whole reason why they need to get on the Seahawk in order to throw the shard off. That's something that confused a lot of people, because there were some people that asked me, why doesn't the Barracuda just like go around the Seahawk? And so that's the reason why. Should have filmed an overhead shot of that to make that more clear. But hopefully people still kind of get the idea. This scene was a great opportunity to kill off some of the more minor characters, because, I mean, at the end of the day, no one's going to get teary-eyed over Hans Johnson's death or Hamish getting shot, you know. So it was a good opportunity to kind of axe them off there. In hindsight, maybe I should have killed off a few more characters here, like maybe Benjamin could have gotten shot. I don't know, just a bit of something to raise the stakes a bit. This jumping animation here, or animation in quotation marks as I like to call it, was something that I was not too confident on. When I premiered this, I was afraid people were going to laugh at the jumping, but apparently people bought it, which I'm very surprised at, because this was a shot that I was never proud of, but it made it into the final cut because I was just too lazy to go back and reanimate that. Now here we are on board the Seahawk, finally. This sequence was just an utter nightmare to shoot. Most scenes I animate I don't spend more than 2 to 3 days max on, but this one took 2 weeks at least. The biggest challenge was the way to keep the deck of the ship mounted on the base plate, well not base plate, but the background of the water, because it kept on sliding off and I'd have to refilm the shot. And then coming up with new ways for them to kill off the elite Marines, that was a bit of a challenge. Because I'm not sure if this really came across in the final film, but the elite Marines were kind of supposed to be like the Praetorian Guards of like a Roman Emperor or something, like the best of the best, the most skilled warriors you could possibly find. and so that's why Stafford kind of hangs around him. And I wanted to demonstrate that these guys were just an utter bitch to take down, even worse than the conquistadors earlier. Well, not conquistadors, but Spanish earlier. I wanted to show that even an experienced sword fighter like Redbeard would have a very difficult time taking one of these guys down. But in the final film, they kind of come off more as just generic henchmen rather than a formidable foe. The script called for all these creative ways that they take down the elite Marines, and some of them were filmed, but a lot of them were just kind of scrapped because it was just going to be impossible to do it. There was one scenario where Gabriel was going to tie a rope around one of the Marines' heads, and then Christopher would pull it, and then they'd basically hang this guy to the mast, and he'd kind of struggle until he died. A bit morbid there, but a bit creative way to take him down. And another way that a Marine was supposed to die was Gabriel was going to push him off the side, and he'd basically bang his head on the lifeboat as he was going down. But both of those were scrapped because they were not going to be very practical to film, and also kind of just extended the sequence even longer. And it was already kind of running a bit long. Now, something that is kind of interesting about this whole sequence here is that Joffrey was actually going to have a bit more to do. In the final film, he just kind of disappears, but in the original script, there was a bit more payoff of his character. Basically, what was originally scripted is that as the Marines were kind of charging the decks, Joffrey would take the opportune moment to go into the cabin to kind of hide. And then later on, as the ship goes into the whirlpool, Joffrey would kind of fall down, and this giant bookcase would crush him. And it was a bit more of a payoff to his character. But it was cut out pretty early on, because even then I knew it would interrupt the flow of the pacing, because you can't go from the emotional death of a hero, such as Redbeard, and then cutting to this slightly comedic death scene where Joffrey gets crushed and he does a funny scream. But looking back, that is something I kind of wish I included, because Joffrey just kind of disappears and you don't really know what happens to him. It would have kind of given a bit more payoff to him. Hopefully that can go in the deleted scenes video. Speaking of things that were cut, this fight between Redbeard and Stafford was originally a lot more extended. As it was filmed, I would originally make a lot more big of a deal of Stafford kind of getting exhausted because the Redbeard would just keep on coming at him, and Stafford would he would sort of get tired, and it would explain why Gabriel's able to take him down later. Because, you know, how does the most experienced sword fighter in Europe get defeated by Gabriel, you know? So that's pretty much the only reason why Gabriel isn't immediately toast when Stafford starts fighting them, because he was already very exhausted by his fight with Redbeard and his multiple wounds that he's received from both Kahuka and Redbeard. I know we've already kind of passed it, but you know what? God damn it, we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it live. Fuck it, we'll do it live. So this scene of the Seahawk falling down into the whirlpool was probably the most complicated effect shot in the entire film. Well, actually, I take that back. The most complicated will be coming up here in a few minutes, but I guess the second most complicated. What I did is that I took a picture of the Seahawk behind a blue screen, and then I sent that to Elliot, and then he'd basically just do that in Adobe After Effects, and he'd animate the ship going down into this cliff chasm. And also what I did was I took a picture of a bunch of cliffs against the blue background, and we superimposed the Seahawk into it. I'm sorry if that sounds complicated there. That's just some of the VFX lingo talking. As I'm watching this now, I think the shots of the French and British fighting each other goes on for way too long. I think we're cutting away from what's important, which is Gabriel and Stafford, and we're focusing on stuff that doesn't really matter, like Captain Javert. Well, he is a badass when he takes down all those British soldiers, but it's not really important to see. That's one of the many things I should have cut down a bit more. All the battle scenes were filmed insanely late in production, like August 2021, just before I went up to college, so that's why it kind of feels a bit rushed there. This whole whirlpool sequence was also filmed very late in production, like late July, early August 2021. The reason that we kind of saved this for last is because, frankly, we had just no idea how the hell we were going to do this. What I originally was going to do is have kind of a blue background and then a kind of a transparent sheet of paper to represent the whirlpool. And what I'd do is I'd put like seaweed or some cliffs behind it, like to kind of give you a feel like they're inside of the sea, like it's almost like a window like into the ocean. But that just kind of proved to be impractical, because the transparent paper that I got was just, it wasn't really see-through, so that kind of defeated the whole purpose. And so I was running really late into production, and so I just said, fuck it, and I just kind of settled for a plain blue background. It's not really that impressive, and if you didn't see the shot of him going into the whirlpool, you wouldn't know they're inside of the ocean, but whatever. We also considered maybe doing this through a green screen. Elliot was all for that, but I kind of vetoed against that because I wasn't sure how that effect was going to look. And in the end, I'm glad we didn't go that route because I'm sure that wouldn't have looked very good. I mean, regardless of Elliot's VFX skills, I doubt even he could pull that complicated of a sequence off. Because we're not just talking like one shot of a green screen, we're talking like the whole sequence of just characters moving around and fighting, and it would have been just a nightmare to do it that way. So I'm glad we decided against that. Also, what was originally intended for this sequence here is that there was going to be a lot of fog in it, but I decided to not do that because I thought it would look a bit too distracting. I sort of did that at the beginning of the sequence, but I quickly faded the fog away because I thought it was going to distract the audience and obscure the frame, so I decided to cut that out. Because if you can't see the action, then why are you invested in it? I mean, I guess it would make more sense if there was a bunch of fog in it, but also you gotta be remembered that this is a movie, so you gotta kind of make some compromises there. This dialogue exchange between Gabriel and Stafford was something that I almost trimmed a bit, but I decided against it because this is kind of the hero's journey aspect of it all, and so it'd be inappropriate to not have this long conversation between these two characters because they've gone pretty much the entire movie without really seeing each other, regardless of that one scene in Blackwater. So it's important to kind of include everything in here because this is where Gabriel's character arc kind of comes full circle. So it'd be very inappropriate to shorten the sequence. Anyway, that's just my thought. Maybe someone disagrees with me. This final duel here was something that I'm admittedly kind of disappointed by. The script called for all this elaborate swordsmanship, Stafford doing all these sick moves, if you will, and Gabriel just being barely able to catch up. Even though Stafford is wounded and he's not at his greatest point, he's still almost able to kick Gabriel's ass there, which shows you just kind of what kind of a villain you're dealing with. And the animation isn't really as intense as I would have liked it to be. I mean, even the final battle in the Legend is a bit more intense than this is. As I mentioned previously, this was filmed pretty late in production, and so at that point I was just like, looks good, great, let's go on to the next shot. No. It just kind of comes off the same as all the other sword fights. Which is a shame, because this is kind of supposed to be the big one, if you will. This was supposed to be the Anakin versus Obi-Wan sequence of this film, but it didn't really come across that way. There were a couple rejected ideas that were originally scripted in the sequence. One of them was that a giant lightning bolt was actually supposed to come down and strike the ship. It was going to be revealed that the shard had the power to attract lightning bolts, kind of similar in the way of how it was supposed to attract sea life to it. And when this lightning bolt would strike into the ship, it would cause a bunch of flames, and the characters would have to kind of climb the higher ground to avoid the fire. And so it'd be a cool image of the two almost like dueling in hell. You know, there'd be a bunch of smoke and flames, and the filter would kind of go all red. And it would be a really intense battle, but I decided to scrap that because it would just be way too impractical to do. And we've already kind of had a fire battle in Blackwater, so it was just going to be redundant. Another idea that was kind of scrapped was that in the script it mentioned how they would climb onto the mast and there'd be a duel like on top of the ship, and they'd swing on ropes like classic like Errol Flynn shit, and it would just kind of drop because that would also be impractical to film, and it also looked a bit too goofy. Like, this is supposed to be a fight for survival, and they're doing all these fancy flips and sword maneuvers, so that was kind of scrapped. Another rejected concept of this scene, there was a lot of them, admittedly, was that there was going to be a moment where a French ship would fall into the whirlpool, and then the characters, or I'm sorry, Gabriel and Stafford would have to avoid it, and then the collision of that ship would split the Seahawk in half instead of it just kind of crumbling on its own. But that was also rejected because, again, it would be impractical to do that. Something that we kind of went back and forth on was how exactly Stafford was going to get killed here. Well, he was always going to fall into the pit, but we weren't quite sure how it was going to get to that moment. We had to make the decision of, do we want to show Stafford as the ruthless sword fighter and have him win the duel, and then Gabriel, by a stroke of luck, just somehow manages to slice him? Or do we want to show that Gabriel has finally overcome his weakness and is able to take down Stafford? So at the end, we kind of did a mix of both, where he comes back up and he is able to stab Stafford when he's at a vulnerable point. So I think the mix of the two ideas was something that was good to do there. I know we kind of already passed it, but I'm going to talk about Stafford's death scene a bit. It was inspired by the death of Gaston from Beauty and the Beast. That, I think, is one of my favorite deaths in cinema history there. I just love the concept of a villain falling to his death, and Disney movies do that a lot. And so I kind of wanted to do the same thing here, where a villain falls from a great height. Similar to Beauty and the Beast, we almost put skulls in Stafford's eyes as he passes the screen, but we kind of cut that out because that would be a bit weird, because not too many people would get that reference. And also, a funny thing about this Stafford's death scene here is that Eli had a difficult time recording this death scream. That's a hard thing to do for any actor, but his screams came off pretty damn funny, I'm not gonna lie. When Elliot and I were listening to him, we pulled up a gif of a ambulance, and we just pissed ourselves laughing because it sounded exactly like that. And that's in the blooper reel a bit there, so... hell, we're already on to the anchor sequence. I was going on such a tangent there. So as I mentioned previously, this is the most complicated shot of the entire film, because it's basically just assembled from nothing. The Kraken was pretty difficult, but this kind of takes the cake here, mainly because of how many times Elliot's computer crashed when we tried to do this scene. He basically had to do this frame by frame, and the rendering for this took forever, but we finally got it, thankfully. And I just want to go on the record and say that this scene appeared in the earliest comics and was not inspired anyway by Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Men Tell No Tales. I know it looks very similar, but I swear I did not rip it off. It was always meant to be in here. But I can see where the similarities are. They both kind of involve an anchor and a last-minute rescue. Something that was in this scene originally was that there was a shot of the sky turning from the stormy gray back to the sunny blue sky. But when I filmed that scene, it just didn't look right, because the plates were kind of off, and it looked like I was changing backgrounds, which is not what I wanted that to look like, so that was kind of scrapped there. The sun's just now randomly out now, and the storms have passed in the locker. Alright, now we're in the home stretch of the movie here. We're almost done, guys. Almost done. This ending whole bit here was inspired from the scene in The Patriot where the French have surrounded Yorktown, and it was also heavily inspired by the ending scene of the Amistad where all the slaves get freed. So it was kind of a Frankenstein mesh of those two. I originally almost used the track from the Amistad movie, but I thought that would be a bit too recognizable of what I was trying to do there. I thought people would say, hey, wait a minute, this is very, very, very similar to that Amistad movie. And so I switched the music out with the dinosaur soundtrack from James Newton Howard, which I think is a very underrated movie. I thought the critics were way too harsh on that, but anyway, back to my film. Everything to Broadside in the throne room was filmed very early on, like August 2020, and so it's combined with all these new scenes that were filmed at the end of production. So it's interesting to kind of see the contrast of the early production shoot and the late production shots there. The throne room was also originally a lot longer because I wasn't sure just how long the sequence was going to last, and so there was originally a lot of animation of just them pulling out papers and pens and like signing terms, but eventually that was all kind of cut down because the story kind of needs to wrap up here. The shots of the islanders celebrating their freedom was actually a reshoot because I wasn't satisfied with the original stuff I did for it, and so I went back and I reanimated it, which is a rarity because basically that never happens. So you know you've done something bad when I have to go back and do that. Hopefully some of that footage can make it onto the deleted scenes or unused footage reel that I eventually upload. I'm glad I ended it with a shot of Kahuka's mask, because that's something that was not in the original script. It kind of is nice to end off on that image, because it kind of shows that even though he's gone, he's going to have such a tremendous impact on the future of the Islander culture. People are always going to remember the story of Kahuka and how he defended the island, and it's going to be passed on to generations. But now that the Europeans have discovered this, I highly doubt they're going to leave that island alone. I don't know, maybe they will, but I'm not sure it's going to be such a happy ending for them when that time eventually comes around to them. This whole ending scene of Barrett and Gabriel going onto the ship was filmed very early on, like June 2020, so one of the first scenes we actually shot. So the movie's kind of come full circle. We're ending off on something that was shot pretty early on. Shooting the ending sequence this early was good and bad because it got it out of the way, but it was also bad because it kind of got me into a false sense of security that this movie was gonna not take that long. which I initially thought in the early months of production, but that turned out to be false. As I'm watching this now, something that kind of looks a bit dumb is Gabriel's captain's uniform there, because now he's wearing a Redbeard's hat and his shoulder pads there, and he just looks like a doofus. I'm not really sure what I was thinking there, but it's in the film for less than a minute, so it's not that big of a deal. Now, despite me filming this pretty early on, this wasn't actually edited until like January of 2022. And so, just as a final fuck you to me, the sound effects here were very hard to find. I had to go to some really obscure clips to get sound effects of sailors just shouting various orders. So, that was a final obstacle for me to overcome there. And of course, there was one last joke of Mr. Stone, because of course we need that. Mr. Stone saved cinema, Martin Scorsese 2022. Now, right from the earliest point of production, I was always intending this to end with the end credits theme from the Mummy. I love the shot of them all going off in the sunset, and so I wanted to kind of do the same thing here. I even used the same music track, so that was always in my head from day one. Because this film was kind of a mix of all sorts of movies. Like, the Mummy is a big inspiration, but The Patriot and Lord of the Rings are up there, so there's that. This is a tribute here I've done in every one of my films to John Miskelin here. It's kind of almost moved past John in a way and more about the HEAL Foundation of McLean County and how it's helping people with autism embrace their qualities. Because I just want to demonstrate and show people that no matter what people tell you that you can't do, deep down inside of you, you can do it if you set your mind to it. I know it sounds very sappy and cliche, but that holds true. There are many times where I doubted that I'd be able to make this film, but I pushed on through. Now, for some reason, the end credits of this were just a bitch to get done. I got these done in like February 2022, so this was about the last thing we did on this production. The reason it was so challenging is because my computer kept on crashing every time I tried to render it, and so we had to redo this 4 or 5 times before we finally got it right, and eventually we got it right, which thank God, because we were getting a bit frustrated on that, so it all turned out alright in the end, though, which is sort of the theme of this production. I suppose now is the time where I can reflect on the film and what it's all about and what it means to me. First of all, I just want to say that this film even happening is nothing short of a miracle. If it wasn't for COVID, I probably would have never started on this thing, which I guess is one of the only few good things to come from COVID. I never could have imagined that this would actually become a movie. This was just kind of a little fun little side project I worked on throughout the years, just writing various speculation scripts, but seeing them on my screen right now and recording the commentary for it is just enough to get me choked up here, you know. This was not a singular effort. This was very much a group collaboration. I mean, you don't just make a feature-length brick film by yourself, so I'm truly grateful for all the help I've received in this production. There were days where it was a struggle to get through, and there were days where I thought that no one would like this, or there were even days where I just considered giving up, but I kept on pushing through, and that was no thanks to all the support I received. Seeing this vision finally come to life is something that's just truly amazing, and I would not have been able to do it without the backing of all of you. As I'm currently recording this, the video sits at around 30,000 views, which is just absolutely insane. All the support and feedback I've received is just absolutely amazing. Just looking into the comment section and seeing someone say, you know, I really like this film, that just makes my day. If I'm able to entertain you and reach you, that means I've done my job. I really hope that other young aspiring brick filmers are able to see this film and want to make their own projects. Just to think that I can inspire others to pursue their own passions of filmmaking or brick filming is just something that's remarkable to me. I think I'm going to wrap this one up early here just so I don't run the risk of repeating myself too much. So yeah, just a final thank you to all the voice actors. There's far too many of you to individually list here, but you know who you are. Thank you, Eli, for helping me rewrite the script and turning it into a much better final product. And a huge thank you to Elliot Miller. Without you, this film would not have existed, and I really mean that. You were able to add all the VFX stuff to it, and you were able to make it into a much better looking film than it otherwise would have been. And just a huge final thank you to everyone who was involved and to everyone who viewed this movie. You guys are what keeps me going, and I truly mean that. So yeah, this has been the Director's Commentary. I hope this was helpful to all of you, and I hope to see you in the future. This is Thomas Brady, signing out.
Finally! Land!
We're not at sea anymore.
You are very bright, Patrick. Thank you.
How are we gonna get out of here?
Great question. Being stuck with you two is going to be a real highlight for my already miserable life.
Oh, don't worry, Giles. This is a popular trading route. Won't be long until we're picked up.
Thank God.
Now all we have to do is sit and wait.
Indeed. Just nice, simple, quiet tip.
I spy with my little eye something blue.
The sea.
How did you?
Because it's the only bloody thing out there.
I don't think he likes the game much.
No, I'm having a bloody wonderful time. Why wouldn't I be?
Oh, 95 bottles of rum on the wall, 95 bottles of rum. Take one down, pass it around, 94 bottles of rum on the wall, 94 bottles of rum on the wall,
Help!
94 bottles of rum.
Anyone, please!
Take one down.